I used to work for a small startup company. I'm not even really sure what they did because I was just a security person, but I always thought it was a little strange that they even felt they needed a security guard. The office was really small and looked somewhat unimportant, like any other office. It made my job easy though, because I didn't have to parade around multiple floors all night. I got in at 9 and turned on the security alarm systems, then headed to the little security room that had all the camera screens set up. The place only had outdoor cameras, which were really low quality. The first couple hours went by slowly, with the usual nothing going on. Sometime around 1 a.m. though, I heard what sounded like a latch clicking shut. I sat there confused for a moment, then stood up and opened the door to the hallway. Everything looked exactly how I'd left it. There were only 3 doors down the hallway, and each one was closed. I walked over to each door, opening them and briefly looking around. The rooms were layered with a bunch of office desks, but from what I could see, it was all normal. By now, it had been long enough for me to start wondering if the sound I heard was actually what I thought it was. Maybe I just didn't hear it right. After all, the security systems should have triggered an alarm if someone had opened one of the main doors to get inside. So I went back to the room, this time leaving the door open to the hallway, so if I heard it again, it'd be more clear. Then I sat back and continued monitoring the cameras. I checked the footage from the previous few minutes just to see if I missed anything, but I didn't see anything at all. No movement outside the building. Another 20 minutes passed. I think by then, I'd pretty much came to terms that whatever I heard was nothing, as I was back to not paying as much attention. Then, a sound echoed down the hallway. It was faint. A door, opening slowly. I jumped up from my chair and walked into the hallway, not believing what I heard. I immediately saw one of the doors was cracked open. Knowing that none of the alarms went off and nothing had showed up on the cameras, I was extremely confused. I was sure that nobody could be in here. I crept over and opened the door a little further, revealing the dark office room. I took a few steps inside, but didn't hear or see anything, so I started to walk further in, going past each office desk. Then, as I got to the back of the room, I saw the slightest movement on one of the walls, like a shadow or something, before I turned my head and instantly locked eyes with a person crouched underneath one of the desks. It was a man with black hair and large dark circles under his eyes. He had a look of both fear and anger, like he was both mad and worried that I'd found him. The instant we saw each other though, he started getting up. I had no idea if he had any kind of weapons on him, so I took no chances and started running for my life. I went into the hallway and out the front doors, which triggered the security alarms and automatically notified the police. I went a safe distance away, then tried to watch the front doors as I waited for the officers to show up. It only took about 30 seconds before the door swung open and the man came running out. He ran around to the other side of the building, and from there I lost sight of him. When officers got there, we downloaded the footage from the whole night, but nowhere in it did we see the man enter the building, so we don't know when or even how they got in. Obviously, the other question is why they broke in. After discussing it with the company, they said they knew nothing about it and didn't find anything missing. I have a hunch that they might have known more than they let on though. Hiring security for their tiny office isn't normal unless you have a reason to. I think it might have actually been an old employee that they knew was a little unhinged. Anyway, I stayed there for another few months, then called it quits for a better job. I never found out anything else about what happened that night. This was during our school's winter break. It was the day after Christmas, and I had a part-time job at our town's pizza shop. This place was pretty popular, and it felt like pretty much every kid at my school also worked there. Being so young though, every paycheck made me feel like I was rich, so I always agreed to work whenever they needed me. I thought it wouldn't be that busy this day, because everyone would be staying home with their families still, but I couldn't have been more wrong. Around dinner time, all the indoor seats were taken up, and we were getting tons of delivery orders. My job was to greet and seat people, or do deliveries if needed. Around 8, my manager told me to start taking deliveries. I did a quick one, then picked up another from the kitchen and got back on the road. It was a single pizza to be delivered at a home 20 minutes away. At least the roads weren't busy. They were actually really dead, like barely anyone was outside, which was a very odd change of atmosphere from being inside the pizza shop. Snow was lightly falling down, really only visible under the streetlights. It was so peaceful, I actually drove the speed limit and tried to soak it in, knowing what waited for me back at work. Eventually I got to the customer's house though. It wasn't really in a neighborhood. It was directly off the side of the road, with its own long gravel road leading up to it. The house was surrounded by snow-covered trees and had over-the-top Christmas decorations all over their house and front yard. They hadn't plowed their driveway though, which made it difficult to find a place to park without getting stuck. I did the best I could, then got out with their order. One thing I noticed when walking up to their house was that while all the outdoor lights and decorations were turned on, not a single light inside was on, at least from what I could see from the front of the house. But as I walked closer, I realized there were shoe prints in the snow going up to the front. I figured it was the owner, obviously. When I got up to the porch though, the shoe prints didn't go up to the door. They went around to the side of the porch. I thought that was weird, but hey, it was none of my business anyway. I knocked on the door. It was pretty cold out there, so after 30 seconds, I knocked again. It was quiet outside, just the low breeze and falling snow, and yet I still heard nothing inside the house. I double-checked the receipt to make sure I needed the payment, then knocked for a third time. I mean, the shoe prints in the snow were fresh, so they had to be home. Getting frustrated and starting to shiver, I knocked one last time, very loudly, probably shaking the whole house. Still, nobody answered. After that, I gave up. I left and went back to my car, getting in and trying to turn it on, but it wouldn't start. The engine kept stalling. I swore under my breath as I tried relentlessly to get it going, only getting more frustrated by the second, and my hands getting colder and colder. Then I happened to glance up and saw a person standing outside the house. They were completely bundled up, boots, jacket, snow pants, everything. I got out of my car. "Hey, did you order the pizza? I've been out here knocking on your door for 5 minutes. They didn't say anything, but began walking toward me. It took me a few seconds to realize something wasn't right, and I got back in my car. The way they kept their pace, not hurrying or anything, gave me the impression that they knew I couldn't leave. And that's when I started to panic. I began dialing 911 as they approached my window. Just when the officer asked what my emergency was, they started speaking. He had a low, deep voice and kept asking if I needed help. How the hell would he know that? That only confirmed my suspicions. I told the officer what I could and how to get where I was. The man outside started getting impatient, moving faster and looking around like he was trying to find a way in. It was absolutely terrifying, sitting helplessly in my tiny car with this likely dangerous man outside and only a thin window between us. I kept trying to get the engine running, praying for it to work. He then started reaching into his pockets, looking for something, but I could see the panic in his face when he couldn't find whatever he was looking for. He then punched the window a few times, trying to break it, before running back to the side of the house like he was going to get something. 2 minutes passed as I sat there trying to decide whether to wait for the cops or leave my car and try to make a run for it. Then I saw the flickering blue and red lights in my mirror, and at the same time, the man showed up on the side of the house, holding something in his right hand. He saw the lights and instantly took off. I'm sure it doesn't need too much explaining as to what happened that night, but that man didn't live there. The owners were gone for the holidays, but the man had plugged in their decorations in the outlet outside the house to make it look like they were home. While I was on the porch, he tampered with something outside my car to keep it from turning on. I'm not a car guy, so honestly I didn't really understand it. Likely the man planned to kidnap me, but out of sheer luck, he must have dropped his knife or whatever tool he needed to break the window, so that's what he ran back to get. Nothing's for certain, of course, but that seems like the most likely case. Anyway, I stopped doing deliveries after that night. It was a pretty typical night in the middle of March. I worked at a gas station at the time. Usually I did afternoon shifts, but every once in a while I'd cover for someone's overnight shift. I had gotten a call in the morning to come in from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m., all of which would count as overtime, so I quickly agreed. I got in and took over for the manager, then sat behind the front counter. It was pouring outside, and supposedly a big storm was gonna roll in later. Seemed to keep most people at home because the gas station was dead. After sitting inside for an hour, I threw on my raincoat and ran outside to prepare the station for the storm. There were a bunch of loose things hanging around the pumps that needed to be brought inside. I started picking them up and running back and forth to drop them off, and as I was grabbing the last few, I noticed a man not too far away from the gas station. He was on the side of the street, pacing around and getting drenched by the rain. It was very unusual, though it looked like he was probably just waiting for a ride. I finished up and headed inside. 2 hours later, thunder started rumbling in the distance, and soon after, heavy winds and even harsher rain came swooping in. I knew it would be bad, but this was insane. The wind smacking against the sides of the building was actually making the whole room shake, and at one point I even thought the front doors were going to snap off the hinges because they swung open so fast. I hurried over and secured the bolt lock to keep them in place, then moved toward the back of the building and into the storage room, away from all the windows, and I just waited. I want to say it was maybe 30 minutes after the storm has started. I was still in the back of the building when, through all the harsh noises, I heard a muffled sound. It wasn't until I heard it multiple times that I realized it was someone banging on the front doors. I left the storage room and looked down the sales floor. There was someone outside, looking in at me and hitting the doors repeatedly. I hurried over and unlocked it, thinking he was in trouble and needed help. He quickly ran inside, and I closed and locked the doors behind him. The man was soaking wet and had pools of water draining from his jacket and spilling onto the floor. He didn't stop to thank me or explain himself. He just kept walking, back and forth, pacing across the floor. It was the same man I'd seen outside earlier. Had he been out there the whole time? It had been over 2 hours since I'd seen him. I tried asking if he was okay, and if I needed to call for help. but the man just kept pacing the floor with this blank, hollow look in his eyes. After watching him for a minute, I got really uncomfortable and started to walk to the front desk to call the police. As I picked up the phone though, his eyes snapped at me and he stopped walking. It was then, as we looked at each other, that I noticed his hands were cut. Like right on the knuckles, they were bloody and bruised. I caught myself looking for too long, and by the time I looked back up at the man's eyes, I could tell he was pissed. "Don't," he said, clearly talking about me using the phone. I wasn't trying to test him, so I lowered the phone. There were a couple seconds where he just stared at me, like he was thinking about whether or not to do something. But then he turned and continued to pace the floor. The storm picked up outside, chaotically shaking the building and adding to the horror of whatever was happening. I tried to think out all my options as this maniac walked around just feet from me. I could try running, but I'd have to get the door unlocked and outrun him in the storm, which seemed really risky. I could also try calling the cops and hope he just leaves, but that was also risky. Funnily enough, I ended up choosing probably the most risky option, which was to do nothing and just wait. I stood there and watched him for, 20 minutes at least. At any point, he could have just snapped and ended me, but he didn't. After those 20 minutes, he gave me one last look, then walked over to the door, slid the bolt lock over, and walked out into the storm. I immediately called the police. I'm not sure if it was just because of the storm, or because they didn't think it was urgent enough, but it took over a half hour for a cop to show up. By then, whoever the hell that man was gone. They never found him. When the storm finally passed on the following day, there was a report filed for a missing woman. She never returned home from work that night after leaving the office at 11 p.m. Maybe I'm just connecting completely different things, but the man had clear signs of having attacked someone with blood and bruises on his knuckles, and the timeline seems to add up. Again, it's all just theories, but whatever I was in the middle of that night, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. Last fall, I turned 16 and started my first job at a really small pizza place in my town. It was a family-owned shop with only 5 or 6 people working there. I only got the job because my best friend also worked there. I was the delivery driver though, and I only worked during the later hours since I had school during the day. It was around my 3rd week on the job that this happened. The night was pretty regular. It was slow, both for deliveries and dining. It was slightly cold out too, which kept most people at home. Around 11 though, a call came in. My friend picked up the phone and put the order in. It was for a small pizza and a soda, so they quickly made it and I hit the road to deliver it. The address wasn't too far, just 8 minutes away, but when I pulled onto the street, I immediately hit a pothole and realized that the whole street was cracked and full of potholes. It looked torn apart and completely uncared for. Our town wasn't exactly the nicest, but this was still far worse than most other places. I carefully drove down, avoiding any potholes I could see, until I made it to the address. It was a 2-story wooden house. The house itself looked just as old and uncared for as the street. But strangely, the yard was full of fresh flowers and plants that clearly had been tended to. I parked at the bottom of the driveway and grabbed the pizza and soda, then walked up to the front door. The wooden steps to the porch felt like they were going to give out, and I got a weird sense of something unsettling. I glanced back at my car, seeing the dense woods behind it and realizing how isolated this place felt. I knocked on the door. Right after knocking, I could hear movement inside the house, and floorboards started creaking. It was soft though, like they were walking lightly and slowly, but I could hear the creaking get closer and closer to the other side of the door until they were right behind it. I prepared myself for them to open the door by smiling and holding out the pizza, but they never opened it. After 10 seconds, I started getting uncomfortable. "Hello? I'm the pizza guy, just delivering your order." There was no response and no other sounds from inside. I could feel something off, so I backed up and walked off the porch. I was still a little hesitant about fully leaving without them paying though. I took one look back, and when I did, I physically felt my body shudder. There was a man standing by the side of the house, staring right at me, looking like he was walking toward me, and I'd only just stopped once I saw him. He looked old and skinny, but had an eerie look in his eyes. I hurried back into my car, and the man didn't say a word and just watched me. I pulled out of there and drove back to the pizza shop. I didn't know what that was. My friend thought it might have been some kind of prank, but that man looked like he was way too old to be pulling something like that. I'm just glad I left when I did, because I don't know what would have happened if that man made it to the porch before I got out. This was only a month ago. It was late September, and where I'm at, we were having a lot of rain. Pretty much every day, it was pouring down. I work as an outdoor security guard for a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, so rain doesn't exactly make my job any more enjoyable. Luckily, the company I work for lets me stay inside on rainy nights, but it always made the shift go by a lot slower. Instead of getting to roam around outside the building, I just had to stand by the glass entrance doors and watch for anything. Anyway, this night I got in at 9, locking up the place after all the employees left. It was pouring outside, so I stayed in and stood by the door, and honestly just tried to stay awake. There was nothing to see except rain and the occasional thunder and lightning. A few hours went by. During that time, I just leaned against the wall and made a few trips to the bathroom. But then, as I stood by the entrance doors, fighting to stay awake, there was a deep, creaking thud. It echoed through the whole warehouse. It sounded like bending metal, or maybe a heavy metal door scraping open. It was enough to make the hair stand up on the back of my neck. I was sure it was nothing, and just a creepy sound because of the circumstances, but it was kind of my job to check on these things, so I walked down the hallway and looked through each of the corridors. I'd never actually explored much of the warehouse, since I was usually outside. All I knew of was the one main hallway that had 5 or 6 corridors branching from it, leading to large open warehouse areas. I looked down each of these, until I got to the last one. At the end, the door was cracked open. I felt a chill run through me, although I still didn't know if it was already opened or not. I walked over and opened it further. The whole room was dark. "Hello?" My voice echoed through the otherwise silent warehouse. After a few seconds, I started to step back and close the door until I heard something in front of me. It was a voice. It sounded like a man, either mumbling or softly laughing somewhere in the darkness near the tall shelving units. "Is someone there? What the hell are you doing here?" I called out. "Come here." He said something softly. "What?" "Come here," he said a little louder. Still, I couldn't see anything at all. After a couple more seconds, I said "F this" and closed the door. I used my radio to contact the police and left the building through the front. 5 minutes later, they showed up and walked through the building. They came out alone. Security tapes were reviewed, showing what looked like a 50-year-old man with a dark jacket slipping in through a gap in one of the back garages. From there, he made his way into the warehouse room, where I heard him in. And disturbingly, on the footage, it looked like he was holding some kind of knife. He made his exit soon after I left. We don't know why he broke in, or what exactly he was trying to do by telling me to come into the warehouse. It might sound weak of me, but I quit after that and took up a day job instead. Four years ago, in late October, I picked up a new job at a gas station. My friends were throwing a big Halloween party on the 31st, but because of when I got hired, I didn't have any vacation time, so unfortunately I had to work that night. At least I had most of the day to hand out candy and watch some movies though. I went into work at 8. The streets were pretty quiet, at least of cars, since kids were running around trick-or-treating, so I hoped the gas station wouldn't be busy. Thankfully, I got what I wished for. Only a couple dozen cars came in my first hour, and once it got closer to 10, even less were coming by. Even the roads weren't busy. I kept seeing a police car patrolling the road every 15 minutes, but aside from that, it was dead outside. I was fine with it being slow, but scrolling through my phone and seeing everyone else having fun on Halloween night was a little depressing, so I grabbed some boxes from the back of stuff to refill on the shelves. Another little while passed, and as my back was to the front door, I heard the little bell go off. I turned around and saw 3 men walking into the shop. They were all wearing Halloween costumes, like full costumes with masks and everything. One of them was dressed up as Michael Myers, but the other 2 I didn't recognize, probably some other typical Halloween characters. I could tell immediately they weren't kids though. They were grown adults. One of them even had a long beard sticking out from under the mask and had tattoos going up his neck. I greeted them, but aside from a quick glance, they didn't acknowledge me. Maybe they were just trying to be in character or something. I don't know. But it was already weird that they kept the masks on. I left the aisle and went around to the checkout counter while I waited for them to grab what they needed. I noticed there weren't any cars outside though, which explained why I didn't hear them pull in. I watched them look around for a minute at the candy aisle. Then they picked up a bag of Dum Dum lollipops and tossed them on the counter. "Find everything you needed?" They didn't say anything. I rang it up and told them the total. They paid in cash. As I was doing the transaction though, I couldn't help but notice one of them in the back staring at me. Through the mask, I could only see his eyes, but they were locked on me and looked frustrated or angry or something. It made me really uncomfortable. I finished up and told them to have a good night. There was a pause though, before one of the men walked up to the front door and pulled down the bolt lock. My stomach dropped. The one that was staring at me then immediately came around the counter and shoved me onto the ground. I tried to stay calm and told them to take the money and that I wouldn't stop them. However, the other man walked around the counter and right past the register. They weren't here for the money. He forced zip ties around my hands and lifted me onto my feet. I was completely helpless as they dragged me through the store, and after briefly checking outside, they rushed me out the entrance. It was only as they dragged me toward the side of the building that I noticed an old car sitting in the grass outside the parking lot. As we reached the edge of the parking lot though, a sudden glaring light came over top us. It was a police car pulling into the lot. The 3 men dropped me on the pavement and sprinted into their car. I don't know if it just was that their car wouldn't start, or they gave up, or what, but the officers were able to get them before they got away. Backup showed up not even 30 seconds later. I guess what happened was earlier in the night, the police got a report of 3 men in costumes offering kids candy on the sidewalks and trying to lead them away from houses. That's why I kept seeing a patrol car circling the area. What they wanted to do with me, or any of the kids, isn't for sure, as none of the men confessed anything. It almost makes me glad that everything happened the way it did though, because if I'd sold them that candy and heard later on that it was used to kidnap kids with, I probably would have felt a ton of guilt. Thankfully, it didn't have to go that way. I was on my way to deliver an order from the sandwich shop I worked for. It was a quiet night, around 11 or so. I had my music playing in my car, and I was just running through the motions of the delivery. On my way to their neighborhood, I pulled up to a red light. There was nobody else at the intersection, but for some reason, the light stayed red for what felt like an abnormal amount of time. As I sat there and stared at the light, waiting for it to change, a car pulled up beside me. I only glanced over for a second, not wanting to make that awkward eye contact, but their windows were heavily tinted, like definitely more than what was legal, as I couldn't see a single thing through them. The car itself was black as well, maybe an old Toyota or something. I can't really pinpoint what it was, but I got a really uneasy feeling about them. It could have just been that we were the only two on the road. I'm really not sure. Eventually the light turned green, and I started going. I didn't get very far though, before noticing they hadn't moved. They were still parked at the intersection. Once I got further down the road, I shrugged it off, and just thought it was weird, and nothing else. A couple minutes later, I pulled off into the section of housing that the delivery was in. I'd say neighborhood, but it wasn't really a neighborhood. It was just a line of 10 or so houses, leading to a dead end. Something about it seemed really off-putting. Of all the houses on the street, not a single one had a light on. I 100% would have thought these places were abandoned, if not for the fact that the houses themselves looked really nice. They looked like ordinary neighborhood homes, with not a single sign of anything wrong with them. I figured it had to just be a coincidence that every resident down the street had their lights off. Anyway, the address I had was for the second to last house. I pulled up and parked on the curb, getting out with the order and walking up to the door. I was hoping I'd at least see some sort of light coming through the windows of this house, because it was the one I was delivering to, but standing on the porch, I didn't see any light. Reluctantly, I knocked on the door. When I did, the door swung a bit from its hinges, like it wasn't properly shut or locked. Now this was even more odd. "Sandwich delivery. Anyone home?" It was completely silent. No response, and not even the slightest sound from inside the house. I was gonna leave, but just to be sure I didn't miss anything, I cracked the door open a little further. I could see a hallway and a room. Both were empty of any furniture or decorations, not even a single picture on the wall. It only took a few seconds before dust started coming through the doorway too. I shut it and backed up from the porch. I was very confused and slightly worried. As I walked back down to my car though, I noticed something down the road. A few houses back, there was a small black car that wasn't there when I pulled in. Its headlights were off, and it was parked. Once I saw the tinted windows, I immediately recognized it. I felt my face go white, knowing this could not possibly be a coincidence at this point. I started to hurry to my car, but as I got just a few feet away from the road, I saw something move in the reflection of one of the windows. I wasn't sure what it was that I saw, but I stopped in place. I was standing near the passenger door, and through the window, my eyes fell on the back seat. It was dark, but there was something blocking the back window. It only took me about a second for me to realize what I saw. I turned and bolted back to the house. As I did, the back door to my car swung open, and a man in a black hoodie and black pants came running out. He didn't chase me though. He ran straight down to the road and into his car. I stayed on the porch, and with my heart pounding, I dialed 911. I probably could have gotten in my car and left at that point, but I was too scared to really think straight. Police arrived and immediately told me that this whole street was unoccupied, as the homes were new builds. Guess that explains why I thought they looked so nice and not abandoned. What I definitely didn't expect was to hear them say that they've had multiple reports this past week, very similar to mine. The guy would order something for delivery with a fake name and address, then follow the driver. What happened to me was the closest call of any of them, though. The guy had snuck inside my car and was waiting for me to get in and maybe even drive away. Who knows what he was trying to do. Unfortunately, there haven't been any updates on finding him. I was pretty young when this happened. I think 16 or 17. It was at my first job, which was just some trashy pizza place. They paid slightly more than other places, and I made extra from tips when I did deliveries, so I stayed there for a while. I don't remember too much about the beginning of my shift this night. I probably started at my regular time, around 6, and was scheduled until 12, but the whole first half of my shift went by like any other day. It was sometime around 10 that we got an order for delivery, so I packed it up and left to drop it off. The place was 15 minutes away, in a small neighborhood. It took me a minute to find the house though, because all the trees were blocking the address numbers, and a lot of the homes had long driveways leading far from the road. Eventually I did find it, after circling back a few times. I drove down the driveway and parked closer to the home. It was one of those large houses that looked like it was built forever ago. I got the food and walked up to the front porch. It was hard not to notice how quiet it was in this neighborhood. It felt like I was so far away from everything, especially with the trees everywhere. When I got up to the porch though, the front door was wide open. I'd seen a lot of people leave their doors cracked open before, but the way this one was fully open was a little bit excessive. Anyway, I walked over and knelt down to set the food inside the house, when a voice called out, "Hey, would you mind bringing the pizza in here? I'm just setting up the table." It was a man's voice, but they sounded friendly. I knew it was frowned on to enter someone's home while delivering, but honestly, it was a fairly normal request and usually didn't take more than a few extra seconds and typically secured a good tip. I stepped inside and walked down the hallway into the kitchen. I set the box on the table, but nobody else was in there. I'd just heard his voice only moments ago, and I never heard him walk anywhere else. I also noticed the house was extremely quiet, like no other sounds at all. I felt a shiver run through me, and as I decided to leave, his voice called out again. "Can you bring it in here, please?" His voice came from the other hallway connecting to the kitchen. There was a single door that was open, but whatever room was behind it was dark. There was no light on. It also sounded like his voice came from right behind the doorway, like he was standing just out of sight. After a few seconds, I turned around and fast walked back out the front door. I got in my car and drove back to work, and I never said a word about it. I thought I'd either get made fun of for being scared or for being stupid, so I just kept it to myself. Thinking back on it now though, there was definitely something up with that guy. Nothing about that encounter was normal. I'm just glad that at least I was smart enough to leave when I did, because there's really no saying what would have happened if I went into that room with him. I was 20 and worked with my parents at a really small takeout restaurant. We specialized in to-go orders. I was in college at the time and was on a very hectic schedule, but my parents were kind enough to offer me a laid-back position just as a general worker, usually just working the to-go table or cleaning up the place after closing hours. This was during early December, and with finals coming up, I didn't have much time to work during the day, so I was taking up mostly late night shifts where I'd just clean for a few hours, then head home. One of the nights I was working, I noticed around an hour into my shift that a car was parked in the parking lot. The way our restaurant was laid out, it was a standalone shop with a tiny parking lot in front of it, so there was no crossover between other stores or businesses. I thought whoever parked there probably just didn't think anyone would care. And they were right, because I really didn't care. 20 or so minutes later, they left. However, the next night, around the same time, the car pulled into the parking lot again. The first time it was fine, because I thought it was just a one-time thing, but coming back again was strange. I walked up to the front of the building and looked out. It was an older gray sedan with dark windows. They didn't seem to be trying to hide or anything, because they were facing right at the building, and they kept their headlights on. I double-checked that the doors were locked before getting back to cleaning. It was hard not to feel like they were watching me through the giant glass front windows, but just like last time, they left not too long after. I finished up my work and clocked out an hour later. Walking to my car in the parking lot, I felt really uneasy. I knew they had left, but it was just concerning that the same car came by 2 nights in a row for seemingly no reason. I drove home and got some rest. Having a lot of schoolwork to do, I decided to take off the next night, so I didn't return to work until the following night. The whole time I was inside cleaning, I had this anxious feeling that made me constantly look out the windows, expecting that car to come back at any point, but I never saw them pull in. I was inside for nearly 3 hours and finished everything I had to do, and not having seen the car come by this night, I felt like maybe it really was all nothing. I packed my stuff up and headed out, locking the door behind me. As I walked through the parking lot, that anxious and uneasy feeling rushed back to me. It felt like I suddenly got a burst of adrenaline, making me sweat and look in all directions. Then, as I was halfway across and standing out in the open, my eyes spotted a car sitting in the far back of the parking lot, away from all the street lamps that lit up the area. Within seconds, it started moving, quickly driving toward me. I sprinted to my car, but I could hear their tires skidding on the pavement as they sped up right beside me and slammed on the brakes. I stumbled forward, thinking they were about to hit me. I was only a few feet away from my car at this point, and suddenly the doors of their car swung open. I didn't even turn my head to look, having my focus completely on getting into my car. Footsteps rushed behind me just as I opened my car and got in. Through the windows, I saw 3 men wearing masks and hoodies sprinting up to me. My hands were shaking as I tried to get my car to turn on. The men started banging on the windows and trying to get the doors open, but I barely got it in drive and drove past them. I got out of the parking lot and onto the road, and from there I was safe. I called 911 and pulled into a well-lit gas station nearby to wait for them. Unfortunately, the outside of our shop didn't have any cameras, so the information the police had to go off of was minimal. I couldn't even see any of the men's faces. After that night, it's no surprise that I never saw the car or the men again. It was mid-January, and it was snowing every day here. I work from home, thankfully, so I didn't have to deal with the awful weather too much, aside from going to the grocery store and whatnot. Some of the days it was pretty bad, with heavy snowfall and gusts of wind. This day, I was in Zoom meetings all day for work, but my connection was really poor and not making for the best experience. Around 6, my connection had cut out completely, and I ended up just having to call it a night from work. The sun had already set by then, but I took my dog outside to use the bathroom really quick. The wind was so cold, it was painful. But while I was out there, I noticed a person standing near the road. They were just standing there, not doing anything, which is fine, but also strange in this kind of weather. I didn't stay out there long enough to really think about it, though. I hurried inside and warmed up, drying my dog's paws off and bundling up under some blankets on the couch. I turned on the news to play in the background, just in case there were any major updates or possible blizzards coming in. Only a few minutes went by when my dog suddenly perked up, and a few moments later began growling at the front door. I didn't have any curtains open, so I couldn't see outside. I got up and walked over to the door. There was a guy walking around outside my front patio. I could see their shoe prints in the snow, going back and forth, as if they'd been walking around for a couple minutes already. He went back and forth again, before walking to the side of the house and disappearing. After a minute, I went back to the couch. My dog, Gracie, was laying down again and didn't seem alarmed anymore. I wasn't really sure what to think about that guy walking around outside my house. It was odd, for sure, but enough to call the police over? Probably not. I just kept an eye on Gracie to see if she heard him again. The rest of that night, though, there wasn't anything else. I took Gracie out one more time around 10, and it was even colder and snowy outside, so surely nobody could be out here anymore. I then went upstairs to my bedroom and got ready, then hopped in bed and fell asleep. Actually, I'm not really sure if I'd fallen asleep yet, or was just about to, but I remember opening my eyes to seeing Gracie standing at the bedroom door. She was just staring at the door, head perked up and tail under her legs. I whispered her name, trying to call her over, but she didn't move. Gracie had always been nervous about strangers, but she'd never acted like this inside our home, so I knew something was up. I threw the covers off me and got out of bed, quietly walking to the door and putting my ear against it to listen. I don't know what I expected to hear, but it was quiet. I put my hand on the doorknob, about to unlock and open it, when someone on the other side twisted the handle. I stared in fear as it slowly moved back and forth. Someone was on the other side trying to open the door, and I was just moments away from unlocking it. I could feel my heart pacing faster, and at first I tried to stay quiet, but as the person started to get more aggressive with trying to open the door, I realized they already knew I was in that room. I ran to the bed, getting my phone and dialing 911 as I tried to look for some kind of weapon to defend myself with. It seemed like after I started moving around though, the person fell quiet, not trying to open the door and not moving in the hallway. Still, I grabbed my clothing iron from the closet and proceeded to tell the operator that I needed help. I want to say I waited 10 minutes for cops to arrive. They came in and found no one else inside. The front door was wide open though, probably lockpicked, and snowy boot prints were all over the hallways. They had no intent on stealing anything. They were just looking for me. Unfortunately, that's where the trail ends. The guy came and left with no other traces. I don't think I'd even be able to sleep at night, if not for Gracie watching my back. It was the day before Christmas Eve. I had hopped in my car to do a few DoorDash deliveries, hoping the holiday season would bring in some better tips. It was around 11 p.m. when I got this order. It was a normal one, just a bag of food to drop off at their house. Most of my previous orders were actually grocery deliveries, probably because stores would be closing up for the next 2 days. The address on this one was far though, farther than I'd usually be willing to drive, but with not many other orders coming through, I took it anyway. It was lightly snowing outside, and the roads were very quiet, making the drive peaceful. The house was not in an average neighborhood though. When I pulled up to what I thought was going to be the entrance to the neighborhood, it was actually just a thin path through the trees, with a small cabin-looking home at the end. I pulled down and parked, getting out with the food. I walked up to the door and gave it a few knocks. Inside, I could hear chatter, like a group of people laughing and talking over each other. It sounded like so many people, I was actually confused on how they could all fit in such a small cabin. There was also something strange about the way it sounded that just didn't seem right. Something was off. Then the door opened. A man stood in front of me, and the contrast to what I expected had me put off for a second. The inside of the house was still, motionless. Nobody was running around, and most of the lights weren't even on. And yet, the sound of a huge holiday party was coming from the small room at the end of the hallway. The man smiled at me. "Why don't you come bring the food inside? They'll be happy to see you." That was an odd thing to say. I began stuttering, trying to say no and make up an excuse, but the man interrupted. "They just want to thank you for working during the holidays. You'll be glad you stopped by." All the while he was saying these strange and honestly creepy things, the chatter in the back of the cabin continued, until it suddenly cut out. Just like that, the cabin was quiet. It was like a recording or tape had stopped playing. The man looked back for a moment, clearly not expecting that to happen, and before he could do anything, I dropped the bag on the porch and ran back to my car. I got in and drove away. I stopped doing deliveries for the night and just stayed home for the rest of the holidays. I know nothing actually happened at that cabin, but it's how disturbingly strange everything was, and the thought of what could have happened that still freaks me out. It was the day after Christmas, and I worked at a small family-owned grocery store as an overnight stalker. I'm not even sure why I was scheduled this night, because we were closed for Christmas, and it was probably really slow during the day, so there wasn't much for me to do as far as stalking. I spent the first hour filling what little needed to be filled on the shelves, but then I kinda just wandered around. As I was walking past the front of the store, I noticed a person outside, unusually close to the building for this time of night. It looked like he was just walking around, but he quickly noticed me looking at him, and instead of going away, he came closer to the window. He didn't say anything or try knocking, he just stared at me. I felt really uneasy and wasn't sure what to do. After a few seconds of him not looking away, I turned and walked away from the window. I guess I was just trying to play it off, like I wasn't bothered. That was very strange though, like no normal person acts like that. I waited a few minutes before going back to the front of the store and looking out the window. He was gone. I sighed in relief, then continued walking around the store to pass the time. I was just weaving in and out of the aisles, fixing up some of the shelves. Maybe 10 minutes had passed when I rounded the corner at the end of one of the aisles and immediately stopped walking. There were several boxes that had fallen off the shelves and were scattered on the floor. They weren't small things either that could have just tipped over. They had to have been knocked down or moved by someone. Just as I was trying to process it, I heard something from down the aisle. A soft but deep and eerie laugh, like a man quietly laughing right around the end of the aisle. It almost sounded unnatural, like a grown adult giggling like a child. Part of me thought about going to confront him, but when I remembered the man I saw by the window, they were fairly big and could have had something hidden in their jacket. I ran to the front and out the doors, getting in my car and calling the police. They pulled in 10 minutes later, and the man inside the store was gone. We later got hold of the security tapes and saw him find a way in through a side door, and as he hid behind the aisle, laughing at me, he held a knife in his hand, some kind of small switchblade. Cops think he wasn't sober, and I don't disagree, but I also don't think it changes anything. I could have died that night if things had gone any differently. I worked at a gas station for 2 years, starting in 2015. During the winter on my first year, I had a regular customer come in a lot. I worked night shifts, so whenever anyone came in more than once, I'd usually recognize them. This guy was a trucker who told me his name was Paul. He was a really nice guy, though he definitely had something different about him. He was always smiley, like too smiley and happy, especially for it being the middle of the night. Sometimes I actually found it creepy. Anyway, one night he came in and he was acting differently. He walked in and greeted me, but as he looked around the aisles, his face was dull and almost angry. He picked out an energy drink and came up to the counter, and his face suddenly changed back to that overly happy look. I could see dread in his eyes though, making his smile seem even more fake and almost disturbing in a way. He paid and walked out to his truck, then drove off. I'd almost forgotten about it until the next day when I saw his truck pull in again. It was pretty cold and snowy outside. When Paul came in, he had that same look as yesterday, except he didn't smile at all. He grabbed the first drink on the shelf and came up to the counter. As he paid, he started asking me questions, like how busy it was tonight and when my shift was over. Then, before he left, he asked if I wouldn't mind helping him lift something in his truck. Having known him for so long now, I agreed, wanting to be helpful, and put on my jacket and followed him outside. The gas station was empty, aside from his truck, parked on the far side of the lot. I followed him over there, and he opened the passenger door, then walked around to the driver's side and got in. He said it was right up here, gesturing for me to get in as well. I climbed up and sat down. It was one of those big box trucks that had a door behind the seats for access to the cargo section. I looked at Paul. He had that strange, wide smile again. "It's just right in there. I'll follow behind you." He pointed at the door. I suddenly felt very unsettled and could sense that this wasn't what he said it was. I sat there, trying to figure out what to say or do, and I began to notice an odor. It was strong and disgusting, coming from whatever the hell was behind that door. I looked back up at Paul. His face was tense, but he held that smile and just watched me, waiting for me to move. I jumped back out of the truck, slamming the door behind me and hurrying back into the station. He didn't follow. As I was hurrying back though, I thought I heard him yell, like a frustrated yell, coming from the truck. The wind covered most of the sound. He pulled out of the gas station soon after. I worked there for another year, and Paul never showed up again, not even once. I don't know what was back there, or what was really going on with Paul, but I think I was lucky to not have to find out. My name is Trevor, and I'm a freshman in college. I don't have a lot of bills to pay, as I'm lucky to have a supportive family. However, I still have to pay for my own food, and for whatever random activities that I want to do with my friends. I do Uber Eats every once in a while, just to make enough to afford these things. I drove an old beater Honda Accord that probably belonged in the scrapyard, but it did the job, I guess. Anyway, I had been delivering for a couple hours on this day, and it was about 10 p.m. when I picked up an order from Wendy's. There was nothing abnormal about it, at least from what I knew. I drove 15 minutes down the mostly empty highway. The turn was directly off the highway on some gravel road. It was in a forest, and without any streetlights, it was very dark. The headlights on my Honda were really dim too, which made it really difficult to drive down this road. All I could see was about 10 feet ahead. After a minute, the road stopped very suddenly. I checked my Uber Eats app, and it showed that I'd arrived. However, I didn't see a house anywhere. I stepped out of my car and took a few steps in front of my headlights, trying to see if there was a path or something. I didn't see anything. It was just woods and trees. I started to wonder if maybe I had missed a turn somewhere along the gravel road. I turned back around and opened my car door, but as I was getting in, I spotted a light in the woods. It was just a small, dim light coming from between the trees. It wasn't moving at all, which made me think it might be a porch light. I walked a little bit closer to try and see, but it wasn't bright enough to show anything around it. Literally all I could see was the light itself. I stood there for a minute, awkwardly holding the Wendy's bag and unsure whether or not to walk up to it. Then it suddenly moved. It went behind one of the trees and either turned off or just stayed behind it, because it never showed back up. I was definitely unnerved. Like, if this was the guy who ordered it, then what was he doing? I took a few steps back toward my car, and that's when I heard leaves crunching from directly in front of me. I could hear it getting closer, but still saw nothing aside from empty darkness among the trees. I dropped the bag and got in my car. It took my stupid old car way too long to start, but when it finally did, I made a 3-point turn and began driving back down the gravel road. As I did, I caught a glimpse of a man in the side of my headlights, sprinting through the woods and right at the road, clearly trying to cut me off. I luckily made it past him before he got in front of me, because I honestly don't think my car would have been able to stop or swerve out of the way. The rest of that gravel road, it was eerily quiet. When I got back to the highway, I ended my shift and went straight back home. I looked up that area on Google Maps, and there were absolutely zero houses there. It was just some abandoned gravel road with a dead end. I don't know what I was in the middle of, or how many people were in the woods around me, but I know I'm lucky to have gotten away. I'm a maintenance worker for a small business. They run all their operations during the day, so I work overnight. It makes my job easier because I don't have to work around them, and vice versa. It's technically just a part-time job though. I work from 8 to 12 on the weekdays. This night, I arrived a little late, but clocked in right away and got to work. An hour went by, and as I was cleaning off one of the desks, the phone in the front of the building started ringing. Obviously the place was closed, and I didn't have any business answering it, so I let it ring through. But a couple minutes later, it rang again, and then again and again. I knew it wasn't my boss, or anyone else that worked here, because they would have just texted or called me directly from my cell phone. It's not like they were calling right after the place closed either. The services stopped at 6 p.m., and it was around 9 right now. After the 5th time it rang, I walked up to the front desk and looked at the caller ID. It just said, "Unknown caller." I tried to decide whether to just mute the phone and leave it, or to just quickly answer and let them know we were closed. Ultimately, I didn't want to deal with it, so I just decided to mute it. I walked away from the front and continued with cleaning off the desks. Probably 30 minutes went by, and I had totally forgotten about the phone. I kind of assumed that by now, they had to have given up anyways. It was about 10 p.m., and I was upstairs taking a break in the small coffee room when I heard a sound from below me. It was a beep, just a single electronic beep sound that I'd never heard before. I didn't think much of it at first, until I heard a door open and close. I literally turned my head toward the stairwell and just looked completely stunned for a moment. Who could possibly be coming into the building right now? It was way too late. I was a little nervous, but really hoped that it was just a worker that forgot something. I walked up to the open stairwell and listened for a second before calling out. "Hello? Is someone down there?" I heard subtle footsteps abruptly stop as soon as I called out. There was a pause. "Hello?" I said again. My body slowly filled with tension as I started to worry about the possible other scenarios. Then I heard a couple more footsteps getting closer to the bottom of the stairwell. I quietly leaned over and looked down at the doorway. There was a shadow of a man. They were standing still, probably just a foot or two from the entrance to the stairwell. It looked like they were waiting for me or something. After a really unnerving few seconds, I backed away and moved further into the coffee room, then quietly pulled my phone out and called 911. I just hid behind the bar table and whispered to the operator as I stared at the empty stairwell. It only took a couple minutes for the first officer to make it. I heard him come in and yell for everyone to come out. I didn't hear anyone else say anything, and he made it all the way upstairs without seeing anyone. We didn't get any answers until we got hold of the security tapes. Disturbingly, the guy stood at the bottom of that stairwell for several minutes, holding a knife and looking absolutely unfazed by anything. He didn't seem to have come in with the intention of hurting me. Actually, it seemed like he had no idea I was there until I called out. However, once he knew I was there, it looked like he was 100% willing to harm me if I came in his way. After a couple minutes, and just before the officer arrived, he left out the front door. I guess the biggest mystery is how he got a keycard to unlock the door. That's what the beep sound was. Even I didn't have a keycard. I just had a normal metal key. The search is still open for the guy, and I still work there. Hopefully this was just a one-time thing, but it definitely still has me feeling uneasy some nights. My name is John. I'm 23. I work at a 24/7 bar in my town that's known for our pizza and drinks. We don't really have any other food options, but people seem to enjoy it anyway. I never understood why the owners decided they wanted us to deliver pizzas. It's a lot of hassle for probably not that much extra money. But since we didn't really get that many delivery orders, I was always the only driver during the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift. On this night, I walked into the place being pretty crowded. There were several large groups, and with deliveries being slow, I was helping out with waiting tables in the meantime. There were a few deliveries I made, maybe once an hour, and at 3 a.m. there was another regular delivery for me to drop off. I grabbed the single pizza and got in my car. The address was 15 minutes away, so I typed it into Google Maps and started driving. Everything up until this point was completely normal. This was just like any other delivery, and honestly I was happy to get out of the crowded bar and onto the quiet roads. While driving though, I got caught off guard when my Google Maps suddenly said I'd arrived. I wasn't even in a neighborhood. I pulled over on the curb and tried to figure out where I'd gone wrong. But double checking everything, this was the address that was on the order. It was for the entrance to a forest preserve or park or something. There weren't even any houses nearby that it could have been mixed up with, so I called the customer's number. It rang for less than a second before they picked up. "Hey, this is John. I'm just trying to deliver your pizza, but I think you've given us the wrong address." There was a strangely long pause as I could hear the guy breathing into the phone before he described my car and said to look to my left. I did as he said and literally saw nothing but a completely pitch black forest. Then I saw something move. It was him, waving his arms in the air to get my attention. He was standing in the forest behind the road. I don't know why he didn't just come onto the side of the road where it was easier to see, or even why he ordered it here to begin with. I got out and started walking over. It was hard not to notice how eerily quiet it was outside next to this forest preserve. There were no cars anywhere, and no other people. I found it really odd, too, that as I walked up, the guy didn't move. Like, he didn't meet me halfway. He just stood there and watched me walk across the street and up to the grass just before the edge of the forest, where he was at. I stopped halfway through the grass, realizing this was getting really weird. I waved him over to come grab the pizza and pay for it. The guy hesitated, and instead of walking up to me, he looked behind me and on either side, pretty obviously looking for any bystanders. My nerves were really high at this point, which made it hard to think straight. If my mind was clear, I definitely would have just taken off for my car and left. Before I could come to my senses, the guy started approaching me. He was walking really fast and didn't slow down when he got closer. I stumbled back, but it was too late. The guy grabbed my upper arm and started pulling me back toward the forest. He was clearly trying to be quiet though, not yelling or anything, but instead putting all of his efforts into forcing me back. We struggled back and forth for several seconds before I realized I couldn't break free and started punching instead. It only took a few clean shots to his face before he let go, and by then, we were only a few feet from the forest. I took off running, looking back only to check if he was following. I saw him get up and run into the forest, but to my horror, 2 other guys came out from behind the trees. I got in my car and drove straight to the police station that was on the other side of the block, but obviously the guys had completely run off by then. I actually went back to work after that, explaining what happened to my boss and asking if he had any info on the guy's order. All he had was a phone number, which was already disconnected, and a first name that was most likely fake. After that, he sent me home early with a free slice of pizza, which wasn't exactly a fair trade, but I wasn't complaining. If I'd been dumb enough to walk up to the forest that night, I probably would have been instantly jumped by all 3 men with no witnesses. Luckily, my hesitance to approach him made it an easier fight to escape, but it very quickly could have turned into something far worse. During a period of my life where I was mostly living on the road, I often made money through house sitting and dog sitting. It was super easy and convenient to get temporary jobs that way, and it also paid me to stay at sometimes really nice houses for several days, or even weeks. I was scheduled to dog and house sit at a place in Washington this week. I drove up there on a Thursday and met the owners and the dog. It was a large golden retriever named Apple. She was extremely friendly and loving right from the start, and only an hour after arriving, the owners left for their vacation. With them gone, I decided to explore the house a bit just to make myself more comfortable, as I was going to be there for 5 to 6 days. It was a really large home in a very remote area of the national forest. I mean, this place had to be at least worth $1 million, and it honestly felt surreal to be staying there. That first day, I played with Apple and just got used to the home, then ate dinner and took her out for a walk around 7. The sun was slowly setting, and the whole road I was walking along was a peaceful wooded area. There were no other houses visible in any direction. I brought Apple down the road for about 15 minutes, then turned around and headed back. As we got back to the driveway though, there was a guy. He was walking down the driveway, and as he passed by me, he kept his head down and didn't say anything. He looked like he was 30-ish, with short black hair and some baggy jeans. Now, this was a really long driveway. Like, it took a whole 3 minutes of walking just to get to the house, but there were no other houses connected to this. So where the hell could he be coming from other than the house? I hurried Apple up to the home and got us both inside, locking the doors just in case. The only thing I could think of was that he was exploring the woods or something and just happened to pop out by the driveway. Seeing him walking away though, I hoped that whatever it wasn't something to worry too much about. Nothing else happened that day, and I went to bed that night around 10. This next day, I didn't do much. I relaxed inside with Apple and watched a movie while eating leftovers from yesterday. I felt like staying up late though, and the house had this really awesome upstairs balcony with a fire pit. So once the sun set, I lit up a campfire and sat on the lounge chair. Apple stayed with me for a while, but she ended up going back inside to lay in her bed. 30 minutes passed, and it was maybe 11:30 when I heard Apple start barking from inside the house. It wasn't just a typical bark though, it was very sudden and frantic, and knowing she was such a friendly dog, this really caught me off guard. I jumped up from the chair and ran inside. She was still barking, and it was coming from the other side of the upstairs hallway. When I looked down, I saw one of the doors to a spare bedroom was open, and I could see Apple in the room with her tail between her legs, staring at one side of the room. I called her name, but she just continued to bark, so I hurried into the room. Her gaze was fixed on a door. I could feel my adrenaline start kicking in as I moved toward it and slowly cracked the door open. It was pitch black in there, and I didn't know where the light switch was, but it was a large walk-in closet full of clothes hanging everywhere. And somehow, my eyes locked on a small gap. There was an eye staring right back at me. For a moment, I froze before quickly slamming the door. I could hear the clothes rattling inside the closet as I grabbed Apple's collar and rushed her downstairs and straight into my car. I drove away, hands shaking on the steering wheel, and called 911. Once cops arrived, I waited anxiously for 10 minutes as they searched the home, but came out alone. The guy had already left. We went over everything, and I told them about the person that I saw yesterday, but that was really all I knew, and I really couldn't confirm if it was the same person. What the officers told me is that the man probably knew the family was going on vacation and thought the house would be empty. What he intended to do is unclear though, and honestly, I'm not convinced that he broke in and hid in the closet without knowing I was there. I think he knew, which only makes it more terrifying. Thankfully, Apple noticed him and got my attention, because without her, I don't know what would have happened that night. I live in St. Louis, Missouri, right in the heart of the city. The high crime rate is no exaggeration, as there's new stories coming out every day about awful things. Living here, though, I'd actually never had anything happen to me up until this point, and never even seen anything happen personally. I always felt like whatever was going on was kind of outside of my life, so I tried to go about life as normal. I worked for both Uber Eats and DoorDash, usually on my bike since I was in the city. This day I was doing mostly Uber Eats, and I'd started around dinner time. The weather wasn't great, cloudy and raining off and on, but it's part of the job sometimes, as the money's not going to make itself. Around 11, I found myself pretty far from my usual location in the middle of the city. With the rain getting worse, I was thinking about just biking back to kind of reset my location closer to home, but an order popped up that was too hard to refuse. $30 for a delivery 2 miles away. For reference, I was on the edge of the city, where it merges into a more suburban area with small homes and large apartment buildings. It wasn't a nice area by any means, but it was nowhere I hadn't been before. I rode up to the restaurant and got the bag, then strapped it to my bike. As I was doing this, a car's headlights were lighting up the sidewalk I was on. It was parked a little ways down and had been there the whole time. I got on my bike and started heading out, and as I did, I saw the headlights move out and continue behind me. Just a coincidence, I assumed, but as I made a few turns and cycled into the neighborhood, that same car was still behind me. After a couple minutes, I made it to the apartment building that the delivery was for. I pulled up to the bike rack and swung my chain around it, and moments later, the car pulled into the parking lot. Now I was freaking out a little. Maybe it was still a coincidence, but I was still a bit on edge about them possibly stealing my bike. I grabbed the order and hurried inside, trying to drop it off quickly. I went up to the second floor and got to the room, then knocked on the door. It was a cash payment, which a lot of people do around here, but was super inconvenient right now. As I waited for them to answer, I looked down the hallway. It was dimly lit and really run down. Paint peeling on the walls, missing ceiling tiles, and even some mold near some of the doors. It was also oddly quiet for such a large building. Quiet enough for me to hear a couple people coming up the steps. I knocked on the door again, but kept my eyes fixed on the end of the hallway. I could feel my heart rate rising, like my body knew something was wrong about this. Then 2 men showed up at the end of the hallway. They were walking toward me, making eye contact, like they were staring me down. The person in the room still didn't open up, but I didn't know what to do. I tried to leave and walk past the 2 men, but they blocked the whole corridor and pushed me back. Then the door swung open. Another man, clearly with these 2, helped force me into their room, slamming and locking the door with me inside. I was screaming for my life at this point, with no idea what was going on. They threatened me and took me into the bedroom, which was completely empty of anything. They tossed me in and locked the door. I sat there in the middle of the small empty room and just felt hopeless and terrified. I could hear the 3 men talking, and they said something about getting both of us into a car. Both of us. I didn't know what that meant. Then there was screaming. Not from the men, though. It was from police officers, yelling for them to open the door. From what it sounded like, the men didn't put up any fight. I was helped out not too long after, which was when I figured out what both of us meant. There was another victim in one of the other rooms. I guess 10 minutes before I got there, they had done the exact same thing to a different delivery person. They ordered it, followed them, and kidnapped them. A neighbor had heard the commotion and called for help, which is why the cops arrived so quickly. As far as what was going to happen if nobody showed up, we can't say for certain. None of the men said a word about their intentions, so all the cops can do is assume based on any evidence they could find. Luckily, it seemed like this was their first attempt at something like this, so hopefully it'll be their last. I can't imagine what would have taken place if not for the neighbors saving us. I work for a tech company as a customer support agent on their 24/7 live chat service. Because of the nature of the job, I get to work from home. The downside, though, was that I was an overnight worker. Being in the comfort of my own home and having to pull an all-nighter was a recipe for disaster. This was a regular work night. I had my plugin open on my laptop that automatically receives new chats. I'd probably get 5 to 10 customers an hour, and each chat usually resolved within 2 minutes, so a lot of my job was just waiting. I kept a hot cup of coffee on my desk and had YouTube open on my other monitor. Around 2 a.m., maybe a little earlier, I was helping a customer figure out their refund when I heard something outside. It was a man, seemingly calling out for someone to help them. Something about it sent chills through me, as it sounded like they were right outside my house. Being in the middle of a chat, though, I couldn't get up to check who it was right away. Also, I wasn't even sure if I wanted to. I had a bad feeling. I continued to help the customer, hearing this man calling out in the background for several minutes. Once I was done, I decided to just look out the window and see what was going on. Whoever it was, though, I knew they couldn't possibly need help that bad if they were standing in the same spot for multiple minutes. I went downstairs, and after hearing them call out again, I realized they were somewhere near the back of my house. I went up to the window and peeked through the blinds. My backyard was fenced in, but standing right in the middle was some guy. He yelled again, but his body didn't move. It looked unnatural, as he was standing there, looking as if nothing was wrong. It was really dark, but I could tell he was wearing a hoodie and dark jeans. I figured it was probably best to just leave this guy alone. He was probably drunk or some kind of druggie. I left the window and went back upstairs. Almost as soon as I left, though, the guy stopped yelling. It kinda creeped me out, like he somehow knew I was there, but I hoped that it just meant he was leaving. A minute later, I got another customer to help. I started typing in my message, and before I could finish, extremely loud knocking suddenly came from downstairs. I could tell from the hollow plastic sound that it came from the back door. I knew it had to be that guy, which now made me nervous. What could he possibly want? Clearly, whatever it was, he wasn't going to leave without it. I quickly finished typing, then picked up my phone and reported the guy to the police. Then I went back downstairs. I looked down the hallway, and immediately, I could see him standing at the back door. His face was pressed into it as he stared through the door right at me. He started hitting the door again, and I wasn't sure what else to do, so I kinda just stood there. After maybe 30 seconds, his face fell flat and he backed away. Then he walked through my backyard and climbed the fence. As I watched, though, thinking this was all over, I could see his figure moving through the gaps in the fence panels, and that's when I noticed several more figures moving outside the fence. Police took my account of what happened, and I described the guy as best I could. I think it was a whole group plotting something. Maybe the one guy was just to get me to open the door, and the rest would come after. I really don't know. I just pray this was a random attempt, and not something they were specifically going after me for. If that's the case, then that might not be the last I see of them. I work night shifts at a hospital, specifically in the ER. I'm the front desk worker that typically checks people in, though we still see a lot of crazy things here. Each night is unpredictable. This night started out quiet. We had a few people come and go, but nothing too big happened. I was mostly sitting at my desk talking to my coworker, Amy, about whatever we could think of talking about. Around 2 a.m., Amy went on break to go to the cafeteria, so it was just me at the front counter. Really soon after, like not even a minute after she left, a man came through the front doors. He was wearing a black zip-up hoodie and black jeans. His hair was dark and somewhat long, and looked unkempt, like he hadn't showered or maybe had just woken up. He walked up to the counter slowly and had this strange aura about him. It made me feel unsettled. "I'm looking for Hannah Smith." I didn't remember the exact name he gave, but it was a woman's name, and as far as I knew, they hadn't been admitted recently. Still, I checked the records, but I saw no one by that name. The man seemed uncomfortable as he waited. I told him there wasn't anyone here by that name, and that he may need to check other hospitals in the area. He awkwardly nodded and walked out. I glanced at the security guard, who was standing at the other side of the room, and we both made that eye contact, agreeing that that guy was a little strange. A half hour later, Amy came back. The rest of that shift was quiet and slow. I got out at 4 a.m., saying bye to my coworkers and heading out to the parking lot. This wasn't the largest hospital, but the parking lot was really oversized. It was huge, and all the workers were supposed to park in the back to make room for patients closer to the building. As I walked to my car, a weird feeling came over me, and I randomly thought back to that man that came in earlier. I don't know why, but I suddenly felt unsettled again. Maybe it was the eerily quiet parking lot at night. I walked a bit faster, got up to my car, and got in. I tossed my bag on the passenger seat and started driving. I lived about 20 minutes away. The roads were long and empty, but throughout that drive, I still couldn't shake the strange feeling. I felt like I was being followed or watched, yet every time I looked in the mirrors, nobody else was on the road behind me. When I finally got home, I pulled into my driveway and parked, getting out and going in through the front door. I hadn't even taken my shoes off yet when I heard footsteps sprinting up to the porch. They got right up to the door and immediately shook the handle, trying to open it. Thankfully, I always instinctively lock the door every time I open or close it. As soon as they realized it was locked, they stopped. There was a pause before a familiar voice spoke. "Excuse me, ma'am, can you please open the door? I need help. Please, open the door." It was the creepy guy from the hospital. I didn't respond and shakily took my phone out and called the cops. Seconds later, the man bolted away. I looked out the peephole and saw him run down the road and disappear in the dark, but confirming it was definitely the same guy with the black hoodie and black jeans. When cops arrived, I was hit with probably the most insane, creepy, and downright horrifying information. The back door to my car in my driveway was open. He had been in the back seat the entire drive home, which explains how he got up to my front door so fast. Even more disturbing is that he was probably hoping I'd park in my garage, which would essentially give him access to my entire house that night. Parking in the driveway probably caught him off guard and likely saved my life that night. They used the footage from the hospital CCTV to identify the man and found him a few days later. He was some nobody that I'd never met in my life, but he had some strange fixation with me. He had stalked me from outside the hospital for weeks, figuring out which car I drove, and probably just trying to find a night that I accidentally left my car unlocked for too long. Even though he was caught, he never admitted to anything, and just repeatedly said that he wanted to talk to me, and that was it. This was a while ago, but I haven't heard or seen anything about him since. I'm a security guard for a mid-sized office building. It's located right in the center of the city. Around here, crime rates are pretty high, so it's not uncommon for businesses to have huge losses from break-ins at night. I usually have a coworker with me, but during this month I was alone while the company I worked for was training up a new employee. I didn't mind it at all, though. Being alone was more boring and made it harder to stay awake, but having a partner sometimes could get annoying, depending on who it is. Anyway, it was around 2 weeks into this month when I was patrolling the lot like usual and noticed a couple guys far off on the other side of the road. They were standing around in the dark, looking in my direction. I don't know if they were looking at the building or watching me, but it gave me an uneasy feeling. The next time I made my rounds, they were gone. I took a mental note of it, but I didn't think about it too much. The rest of the night was quiet. I got out at 6 a.m. with nothing more to report on. The next couple days were uneventful as well, but then, one night at the end of the week, I made my rounds outside and saw them again. They were in the same spot as last time, standing in the dark and watching me. It made me uncomfortable again, so instead of continuing my rounds, I stayed out on that side of the building. Maybe if they saw that I noticed them, they would leave. I stood out there and walked back and forth for about 5 minutes before the men walked away. As I was out there, I tried to take notes of what they looked like, but there really wasn't much I could make out from that distance. I stayed out for another 10 or 15 minutes after they left, making sure they didn't come back. Then I went back inside. With them gone, I figured now was a good time to head to the break room and take my lunch. It was about 1 a.m. The break room was at the far end of the hallway in the back of the building. I sat at a table and started eating while scrolling on my phone when I suddenly heard a noise. I put my phone down and looked at the door to the hallway. I'd never heard any noises like that before. After a few seconds, I got up and walked over to the doorway. I stood there for a good 30 seconds, waiting to hear anything, but it all seemed so quiet that I figured it must have been nothing. I went back and finished my lunch. Afterward, I went to the security office and double-checked that there were no alerts or flags. Everything looked good. Usually this was the time of night where I just sit in my chair and wait around, but something in me felt like going to make another rounds. The noise I heard didn't have me nervous though. I think if anything, I was actually just more curious about what it was, and found it as something for me to look for while I was bored. I started my rounds outside, walking around the building. It was quiet, just the ambient sound of the buzzing streetlights. Nobody was out there. I went back inside and started walking through the inside of the building. Usually, unless there was a flag or alert in the system, I wouldn't go checking every inch of the place. I'd just walk up and down the hallway and make sure nothing was off. The hallway was long though, and was in the shape of an L, so it was more like 2 long hallways. On one side was the main door, and on the other side, there was a door to a mini stairwell that had an emergency exit door. It was one that was original to the building, so one of those old heavy metal doors. And as far as I knew, it wasn't connected to the security system because of how old it was. To bypass this, the company just put a huge padlock on it and bolted it shut to essentially make it useless. However, when I got to the end of the hallway and looked through the door window into the stairwell, I was in complete disbelief. The padlock was snapped in half, laying on the ground, and the metal door had been forced open. I felt lightheaded as I hurried back to the security office. If someone had broken in, how the hell did they slip past me unnoticed? Surely I would have seen or heard them. I started scanning through the tapes. I got to the point where I was standing outside, watching the 2 men. After they left, I stayed for a bit to keep watch. During that time, they came around to the back of the building and snapped the lock off, breaking in and going into the workrooms. Disturbingly, they were still inside the building when I came back inside. One of them was just on the other side of a door, literally 2 feet from me, as I walked past him and into the break room. While I was in there, one of them bumped into a desk while trying to hide, which was likely the sound I heard. When I went back outside to do my rounds, that's when they made a run for it. On the tapes, it was pretty clear that they both had weapons, either large knives on their belts, or possibly even small firearms, which makes me think they were prepared to take me down if it came to that. I called the police and handed over the tapes, but nothing ever came of it. They weren't great quality, and the men had their faces covered. The company claimed several hard drives, or files or something, were taken, and they seemed pretty worried about it. However, to this day, there's been no more info on the men or their motives. When I was in my mid-20s, I worked night shifts at a 7-Eleven. I was still doing online school at the time, and I figured most of my shifts would be slow enough for me to get some schoolwork done during my shifts. For the most part, this actually worked out. I'd be the only one there, and it would never really get busy. Whenever someone would come in, I'd just push my laptop aside, and when they left, I'd continue my school stuff. This night, it was very cold and rainy outside, which always made me happy because almost no customers would come in. I had my laptop out and was focused on school for almost 2 hours straight when the front door opened and a man walked in. He looked 30 with a beard and short hair. I put my laptop off to the side and waited for him to come up to the counter. The man looked around the aisles for a minute or two, then walked out, got in his car, and left. Not thinking too much about it, I grabbed my laptop and continued about my work. Another 30 minutes passed, when out of the corner of my eye, I saw headlights pulling up in front of the store. I looked over and was confused to see the same car that was here earlier. I thought maybe it was just a coincidence, but when the guy got out, it was the same man. This time he walked into the store and came right up to the counter before I could even move my laptop. "Restroom?" he asked. "Oh, yeah, it's right over there." I wasn't expecting that question at all. He walked over to the restroom and went in. It was one of those single-person ones, not like a whole room. I couldn't help but think it was a bit odd to come back 30 minutes later to just use the bathroom. Like there had to be somewhere closer to wherever he was, unless he stayed in the area for the whole 30 minutes. He possibly could have been back to also grab something that he decided he needed. I don't know. I waited a couple minutes, and then a couple more, and then it started to get a little unusual. Honestly though, I did not want to be that guy who checks up on him, or knocks on the door, or whatever. Another 15 minutes passed, so he'd been in there for almost 25 minutes at this point, when a police officer pulled into the parking lot. He circled around and slowed down right behind the other guy's car, clearly inspecting it. And after a little bit, he stopped his vehicle right behind the car and got out. The officer came into the store and looked around the sales floor, then looked at me and asked if I knew who was the owner of that car outside. The officer looked more than just curious. He looked worried. I pointed at the bathroom and said he'd been in there for a while. The officer went over and didn't hesitate to begin banging on the door. It was clear something was seriously wrong. After a minute of him knocking and yelling, he looked at me and asked if I had a key to the door. I was kind of shaky, but I sifted through the drawer under the counter and found the key, then ran it over to him. He unlocked the door and opened it, gun raised. The room was empty. I couldn't believe it. After getting interrogated for a minute, I assured the cop that he had gone in there and never came out. The officer did a more thorough search and happened to notice the ceiling was accessible. It was one of those ceilings that's made up of panels where you could just push them out. I guess the man had gotten on top of the sink and was able to haul himself up, The officer called in backup, and within 15 minutes, they found the man hiding inside the ceiling. They got him out and arrested him. As I've been told, the guy was on the run after doing some absolutely horrible things to several random and innocent people. Earlier in the night, they got a description of his car and caught his license plate on a store camera. The officers made it seem like I was lucky because the past individuals he had harmed were all alone in the middle of the night, either working or just walking around outside. Whether the man was trying to hide in the ceiling because he knew the cops were after him, or he was doing so to try something on me, is unclear. Thankfully, he's locked up for good though. I was working my regular 2 to 10 closing shift at a small drive-through cafe. It's a really small place, with just 5 or so indoor seating tables, since most of our business is focused on the drive-through. This wasn't a busy spot though, especially during the later hours of the day. Being the only one working the closing shift, I'd usually sit at one of the dining tables and be on my phone, only getting up if someone came to the drive-through. It was drizzling outside this night, so it was even less busy than it already would have been. Past 7 o'clock, not a single customer came through for 2 hours straight. I was just sitting at a table watching Netflix on my phone when suddenly the front door opened. It kind of startled me, as nobody ever comes inside the shop this late. He seemed to not notice me sitting at the table though, because he walked up to a different table on the other end of the store and sat down with his back facing me. Something was definitely off about this guy though. He was very tall and wearing really dark clothing, and although it was only drizzling outside, he was soaked. Water was dripping from all over his clothes and onto the floor, and that got me thinking about how he even got here. No cars had pulled in, so he must have walked. Anyway, I stood up and walked over to the table, greeting him and asking what he wanted. He didn't smile or say hi back to me. He just sat there with a blank look on his face. I waited a few seconds before repeating myself, but he cut me off. He asked who else was working tonight. I was confused, but also slightly nervous about that question, but I still answered for some reason. "It's just me, but we close in an hour." He then asked for a small coffee, so I walked back to the kitchen and started making it. I grabbed a cup and poured it in, then turned to go back to the table when I saw him standing in the doorway to the kitchen. "Do you need something else?" He didn't respond. Now facing directly at me, I could see that his eyes were bloodshot, but his face was still blank, like no emotion whatsoever. It made me really uneasy. "Put the drink down and come with me." He was demanding it, and he looked ready to force me if I didn't. This guy was way bigger than me, so I really had no choice. I moved slow, trying to think of any way out of this as I followed him. As we left the store though, he grabbed the back collar of my shirt and pushed me across the parking lot toward the road. On the other side of this empty road was a completely wooded area with no buildings or houses as far as I knew, and that's exactly where he was leading me. Just as we were about to cross the road though, a single car came out and rolled past us. As it did, the man stopped, which forced me to stop, and both of us stared at the car and realized what it was. A police officer looking right back at us. I started screaming, and the guy immediately let go and sprinted across the road and into the woods. The officer pulled right into the parking lot and made sure I was okay, then called for backup. What's crazy is he wasn't even on his shift. He was actually heading home for the night and just happened to see us at the perfect time to save me. If he had even been 30 seconds earlier or later, I would have been dragged into those woods, unseen, and probably never made it out. Anyway, the cameras picked up some decent footage of him, but as of yet, still nothing has been found. I'll update if anything else happens, but I just hope he doesn't come back. This was almost 2 years ago now. I was doing what I thought was going to be a regular vacation to where my parents live. I had rented an Airbnb for the first time, so I was really excited. The house was on a large plot of land and was very spacious and quiet. I lived in the city, so this was like luxury to me. I set everything in the room and pretty much left right away to see my family. I spent the whole afternoon with them before heading back to the Airbnb and making a quick snack, then hopping on the couch to watch a movie for the night. It was like 10 or 11, so pretty late, but in the middle of the movie, I heard someone walking outside the house. There was no mistaking that sound, and it just completely threw me off guard. I paused the movie and got up, quickly walking to the back of the house and looking out the back door. It was obviously dark out, but a guy was walking away from the house and toward the trees that were behind it. What's really creepy is that I never heard his footsteps approaching. Like he must have already been standing by the house for a while before I heard him leave. Once he was out of sight, I opened the back door and stepped outside. The back patio was empty, but along the house, there were clear shoe prints in the grass. I followed them, leading up to one of the windows, and when I looked through it, there was a direct line of sight to the couch I was sitting on. I got chills just thinking about that man staring into the house at me without me knowing. I quickly went back inside and covered up all the windows. For the next half hour, I sat in the living room and continued the movie with the volume on low. That way I could focus on listening if he came back. I didn't hear anything, though. Once the movie was finished, I knew I had to get to bed, so I went back up to the window to do one last look to make sure everything was okay. I moved the curtains and saw nothing, but heard footsteps sprinting away from right outside the window. I hesitated before looking out and seeing that same guy running into the tree line. I immediately got my phone and called the police. Of course, by then, he was too far for them to find him, or even really search. However, while we were looking around the house, I noticed that my suitcase in the bedroom was open. It had clearly been searched through, and a few things were even missing. This probably happened while I was with my family, and the guy could have even been still in the house when I came back, only to sneak out of a window before I saw him. Why he came back afterward is what really disturbs me, though. If I hadn't caught him watching me, there's a chance I would have gone right to bed, with him waiting right outside the window. This happened when I was 18, making the road trip from my hometown to my new college. I had all my stuff shoved into the trunk and backseat of my cheap SUV. This was not only my first long road trip alone, but but was also going to be my first time being away from my family for an extended amount of time, so my nerves were reasonably high. Anyway, the directions I was taking said it was 600 miles total, which I split into 2 days of driving. I was taking whatever route the maps had me take, and it estimated I'd make it to the hotel at 11 p.m., but with possible traffic, gas stops, and getting food, I knew I'd likely get there much later. By 7, the sun was fully gone, and most of the cars were gone too. Every once in a while a car would pass by, and I'd see their headlights slowly fade out in front of me, but for most of the drive, it was just me. This actually made me really tired and bored. Around 10, I decided I'd stop at the next gas station before making the final stretch of the drive. About 10 minutes later, I exited the road and entered a gas station. Being so far out, this wasn't a town or anything. It was literally just a gas station with a few pumps and a tiny convenience store. I didn't see any other cars on the road or in the lot, and not even any lights from any nearby houses or buildings in the distance. I pulled right up to a pump and got out to start topping off my tank, and as I looked around, I almost got jump scared by a guy walking up to me. In comparison to myself, he was much older, probably 50s if I had to guess, and he honestly looked homeless. But regardless, being approached out here wasn't something I was expecting, and his short smile didn't make me feel any more comfortable.
"Hi, do you need something?"
I said, hoping he wouldn't walk any closer. The man stopped a few feet from my car and looked around almost cautiously before responding.
"Take the exit back onto the highway."
I looked at him confused, not sure if I was understanding him right. He pointed behind me at the exit I came from and repeated himself.
"Take the exit back onto the highway."
After a second, I said okay, and the man walked off, but I was still really confused. The exit I came from that he wanted me to take again was a one-way road, so by his logic, he wanted me to drive on the wrong side of the road and do a U-turn back onto the highway. It just didn't make any sense. I looked out at the entrance road, the obvious one that I was supposed to take, and there were no signs of any construction or anything blocking it. It just looked like an empty ramp back onto the highway. As I put the pump back and got in my car, I glanced over at the man, who was now just sitting against the side of the convenience store. The more I thought about it though, the more crazy that man seemed, just to be sitting out here saying nonsense. I thought maybe this was some kind of trap or something, so I went with my instinct and drove out of the lot and toward the entrance to the highway. As I merged onto it though, I realized pretty much all the streetlights were out. I slowed down, thinking maybe this was a construction zone or something. I kept my eyes focused on the road directly ahead, making sure to be cautious of anything. But while I made my way through the unlit road, I saw only a brief outline of a figure to my left before a pickup truck came out of nowhere and stopped right in front of my car. Every door opened as 4 men jumped out of the truck and started running up to my car, holding weapons of all kinds. Metal bats, machetes, knives, and not even anything covering their faces. They just had this emotionless gaze, like they felt nothing of what they were doing. I quickly started backing up as they got just a few feet away from my windows, and once I got far enough back, I suddenly saw the outline of dozens of people coming out of the shadows off the side of the road. A few even tried chasing my car as I frantically reversed out of there. As soon as I could, I turned around and sped off. I called 911 once I felt I was safe, but for some reason, I never got a call back. No update on it at all, almost like they didn't even check on it. Ironically though, it was the creepy old guy at the gas station that tried to prevent me from even getting caught up in that mess. Or at least that was what I assume he was doing. Either way, I was incredibly lucky to get out of that with my life, as I have no idea what that was or what they were all planning to do. It was a typical Friday after my college classes were out, and I was spending the night doing DoorDash. This was my regular routine, dashing on the weekends to help me pay for all my living expenses while on campus. The night started well, getting a lot of orders done and making a good amount, and then it hit a stalemate after the big dinner rush. Very few orders were showing up, and the ones that did, they were very low paying, basically waste of time orders. But then after an hour of aimlessly driving around, an order came through that wasn't too bad. It was 8 miles away, but the payment was well worth it. It was nothing absurd, but enough to make it not a ripoff like a lot of the other ones were. I accepted the order and ran into the restaurant to grab the bag, then hopped in my car and started driving. The map said it would take 30 minutes, which I think was the longest of any orders I'd done up until this point. Most of the houses were right around campus, because any further than 15 to 20 minutes out, it becomes pretty much just bare fields of grass. As I got to that 20-minute mark, it became just that. Very few houses, mostly sitting far out in fields of crops, and nothing else. The rest of the 10-minute drive was on this empty road going along these farms. Then I made it to the house. There was a dirt driveway connecting to the road, leading through a large field, and in the far back was a small house. Driving through the field felt very eerie. Even though I'm not one to get nervous without reason, this felt different. As I got further out from the road, the only sound was the low rumbling of my car on the dirt. I parked out front and got the bag ready, then left the car on as I stepped out. The night was quiet, and the house was dark, having only the porch light on to illuminate the outside. I walked through the unkempt grass and up to the porch, knocking on the door. As I waited, I looked back at my car, sitting in the dark, with the field of pitch black behind it. A moment went by, then I knocked again, but there was no response, not even the sound of anyone inside. It didn't take long for me to realize the strangeness of the situation, seeing no lights on in the windows and noticing how decayed the house looked up close. The only thing that made me think it couldn't be abandoned was that I had an order for this address, and the porch light was on. I looked at the light, thinking why would that be the only light? But by some odd chance, I happened to recognize the top portion of the casing having a cheap solar battery. It was just an automatic light that charges during the day and turns on in the evening, meaning nobody had to be here to turn it on. Just as I was piecing this all together though, I heard a rumbling sound behind me. I turned, seeing a car driving down the dirt path and coming up right behind my car. I stood there and stared at their headlights until a man stepped out. I yelled from the porch, asking if this was his order, but he didn't reply. He just stood right next to his car and didn't move or speak. I felt my adrenaline spike as I began realizing how horrible the situation likely was. The silence of the night only reminded me that there was nobody here to help. I was stuck in the middle of a field between an empty house and a stranger. In a split-second instinctual reaction, I dropped the bag and sprinted off the porch, running behind the house and straight into the field of grass. I looked back, seeing the man coming up behind me. Frantically, I continued running, and the further out I got, the thicker and taller the grass became, until it was covering all views of direction. By then, I knew the guy had no chance in following me. I slowed down, catching my breath as I carefully moved through the crops and tried to be quiet in case the man was still trying to find me. Eventually, I made it to someone else's yard, and from there I got to a road where I had enough signal to call for help. Police picked me up and went to check on my car, but of course, the man was gone by then. I was surprised though, because my car hadn't been looted, and the bag of food was still on the porch of the abandoned house. But that could only mean that the man had other intentions, likely far worse than just robbing me. A couple years ago, I applied for a temporary job at a local gas station. I was planning to move in 6 months, so I couldn't get anything too permanent, but I still needed to make some cash beforehand. This job paid well, enough to convince me to work the job opening they had for the overnight shift. I would just stay by the register and occasionally do regular maintenance work. This was during my 4th month working there. At some point during this time, I became familiar with a customer that came in pretty frequently. Almost every night, around 1 or 2 a.m., this guy would walk in and buy random different things. Sometimes it was household items, or food, or tools. I always thought it was weird because he'd come in every night to buy a couple things that would be way cheaper and easier to get at any regular grocery store. He didn't talk much either. All I knew was that his name was Dave, and he drove an old red Chevy sedan. He looked like he was maybe 40 to 45 years old. Anyway, one night at the usual 1 a.m. time, Dave pulled into the gas station. No other customers were here. It was just me sitting in the corner waiting out the time. When Dave walked in, though, there was something different about him. He was dripping in sweat, and he was rushing through the aisles, searching for something specific. When he finally found what he was looking for, he hurried up to the counter and tossed it down for me to ring up. It was a master lock, like one for locking up a bicycle. I really didn't feel like it was appropriate for me to question him, but with the guy sweating and being in a rush, I just felt a little off about this. "It's good to see you again, Dave. You just get a new bike?" I asked in a friendly manner, hoping it would come off as just casual conversation. He didn't even look at me. Instead, he fumbled around for his wallet and started yanking out cash in a hurry. I left it at that and just rang him up, then watched him rush into his car and pull away. Something was definitely weird. But hey, maybe he just got a new bicycle and had been riding it around for a couple hours and needed to get back to wherever he parked it so he could lock it up before it was stolen. Maybe that's a stretch, but it was the best I could come up with. The rest of the night passed by, and so did several more days. I didn't see him for almost a whole week, which was odd considering he usually came in every night. It wasn't until my Wednesday shift that I saw him again. It was drizzling outside, so the first several hours went by really slow. I was leaning back in my chair and looking out the window at the rain coming down when his red car pulled into the parking lot. As soon as he parked, he got out and rushed inside. I greeted him as he entered, but he ignored me. He hurried through the aisles and was talking under his breath. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but he sounded frustrated, and I got really uncomfortable, like my gut was telling me something was wrong. Then I heard a thud. My eyes shifted to the window, looking at the direction it came from, and the only thing there was Dave's car. It was a loud thud, too, like someone kicking the inside of the door. After a second, I looked back at Dave. He wasn't rushing anymore. He was standing in the aisle, staring directly at me, as if I'd just discovered something that I shouldn't have. There was another thud, but my eyes were fixed on Dave as I could feel panic rushing through my body. Then he quickly looked away and hurried out the door. I was still stunned, but managed to get my phone out and snap a picture of his license plate as he drove away. I called the police immediately. That night felt extremely long as I waited for any updates from them, and it wasn't until I got home around 6 a.m. that I received a call from the police. They found the guy from the license plate I gave them, and they found a woman that he had kidnapped. Apparently, he had just moved into a new small cabin on the edge of town less than a week ago, and he had no registered prior address, so they had no way to know what he'd been up to before this incident. Luckily, they saved this woman before she was harmed, though. Also, it turned out Dave wasn't his real name, which isn't surprising, but at least he's locked up for good now. This was a few months ago while driving for DoorDash. I only drive as a side gig, maybe 10 to 15 hours a week. This night I was only doing a couple orders since it was already late, and I had picked up a small order around 1 a.m. It was to be delivered to a business building somewhere across town, which was apparent by the address. This was a normal thing, usually for overnight workers or whatever. When I pulled into the parking lot, though, it was empty. No cars at all, and it didn't look like there was a parking lot behind the building either. I parked in a spot near the front and got out with the food. The place was definitely an office building of some kind and was smaller than most, being only 2 stories and not very wide. All the lights were off in the windows though, aside from one light behind the front door. I walked up to the door and checked the app, seeing it has specific drop-off instructions to enter the main hallway and leave the bag outside of room 232. I looked through the door in the building, seeing this hallway with a bunch of closed doors on either side. Delivering to specific rooms I'd only done at hotels, so this was kind of new for me. I tested the door, pushing on it, and it was unlocked, so I stepped inside. I expected to hear people working, moving around, or talking, but instead didn't hear anything. There wasn't a single sound in the whole building. It was just white noise from the overhead lights buzzing above me. As I passed the first few doors though, they were all numbers in the 100s, like 102 and 106. The room the instructions said to leave it at was in the 200s, so I assumed that meant it was on the 2nd floor. In the middle of the hallway was the doorway leading to the staircase. It was held open with a wedge door stopper on the floor, but the lights weren't on. I stepped in and up to the bottom of the staircase, then looked up. The whole stairwell was pitch black. Not even any light was coming from above where the room was supposed to be for me to drop it off at. Again, I started to notice the eerie silence, and it sent a chill through me. I was always one to do whatever the instructions say, so I'd get good reviews, But this was the first time I told myself that this was too sketchy. I stepped out of the stairwell and back into the hallway, and just as I did, the door right across from me opened. The lights in that room were off, but a man emerged from behind the door and stepped into the hallway. He was wearing street clothes and just didn't look like an office worker at all. But he stood in front of me and pointed past me at the stairwell. 232 is up there. I nodded, but didn't move, and neither did he. He just looked me in the eyes with a look like he was suppressing his anger. After an intense few seconds, I dropped the bag on the ground and started quickly walking to the exit. The man didn't follow me, but I heard his footsteps go into the stairwell and up the stairs as I left the building. I got in my car and left. I didn't know what that was, or if I was maybe overreacting about it, so I didn't call the police. The following day, though, the police actually called me. Apparently the office reported a break-in, and in the CCTV footage, they saw my car and license plate, tracking it back to me. They also had footage of the break-in, and so they called me in to question me about any information I might have. I didn't have much to give, but it turned out there were actually 3 people that broke inside. One was downstairs, who I saw, but the other 2 were shown on the cameras to be hiding at the top of the stairs, seemingly waiting for me to go up. Disturbingly, several other delivery orders were made to that same office that night. All of the other drivers were smarter than I was, though, leaving the orders outside by the front door. What would have taken place in that office had any of us gone up to the second floor is unknown, but hopefully police can find the 3 men before anyone falls victim to it. My name is Caleb Fletcher. I'm 16 years old, and this took place around 8 to 9 months ago, on the 24th of August, which was a Saturday. School had been going on for about 2 weeks, so to de-stress a little, I decided to see if my friends, who I'll call Griffin and Broly, wanted to hop on Fortnite. My mom and sister were out shopping, my dad was working, and I was bored. It was around 8 p.m. when we finally got on to play, because I had decided to make pizza rolls beforehand and ended up burning the batch. After a few rounds, I could tell my friends were getting tired of losing, so they got off after only an hour. I planned on just lying down with my phone and going to bed. That was until I heard my 2 dogs barking outside. It's not unusual for them to bark, given how people typically walk on the side of the road, but I still looked anyway, just to make sure. I didn't see anybody, but seconds after looking out the window, I heard our garage door open and shut. That usually means my dad is home from work, but I didn't see his van outside, and he had texted me earlier telling me that he would be working late tonight. I decided to walk downstairs into the dining room and look out the window to get a better view. From there, I could see that our driveway was empty. There wasn't a person or vehicle in sight. I wasn't the type to go investigate, so I ran back up to my bedroom and texted my family group chat to ask if anybody was home. I told my mom about the garage door, and she told me to turn off the lights, lock my bedroom, and stay there until she got home. So I did just that. About 15 minutes later, I thought I heard our wooden floor downstairs creaking, like someone was trying to be sneaky. I didn't have anything to use as a weapon, so I unclipped my microphone's boom arm from my desk and quietly opened the door. I walked out onto our upstairs balcony and looked over, trying to see if I could spot anyone hiding or anything suspicious. I stupidly yelled, "Is anybody there?" like they were really going to answer. I thought everything was fine though, until I saw a large silhouette of someone standing underneath the balcony. I panicked and ran to the closest room with a door, which happened to be my small bathroom. The intruder must have known I noticed them, because I heard loud and fast footsteps running up our stairs as I locked myself in the bathroom. I had stupidly left my phone in the bedroom, which was the room right next to me. After I built up enough courage, I bolted into my bedroom, locking the door as soon as I got in. My sister's room was right across from mine, and its door was open, so I figured the intruder must have been in there. After locking my bedroom door, I grabbed my phone and typed 911 into it. Just before I called, I noticed that the storage room in my wall was open just a tad. I saw a dark brown eye peeking through the crevice, staring into my soul. The pure terror I felt in that moment is something I'll never forget. I booked it down the stairs and out my front door, running up the hill to my neighbor's house. He was a police officer. He alerted the other cops while I stayed with his wife, and he went down to investigate. I told him exactly where the intruder was, hiding in my bedroom. Minutes later, I ran back down the hill to see if the intruder had been caught. When I walked in, I saw a tall, skinny man with a gray beard and a dirty black coat being pushed onto the floor by my neighbor as he was getting handcuffed. I'm not allowed to be home alone anymore, and we have better security around our house now. My family was just happy to know I wasn't hurt, and they were thankful for my neighbor's bravery. I don't wish an experience like this on anybody, not even my worst enemy. I'm a manager at a mid-sized grocery store. I do 10-hour shifts and work mostly overnights. At the time, our store was having some staff issues that made pretty much every department understaffed and overworked, and overnight stocking was no exception. I had one guy that would help me 5 nights a week, but that was it other than me. This was on his day off, so it was only me working. I got in at 10 and was alone by 10:15. After running some numbers in the office, I started pulling out loads of boxes to the aisles to start unpacking and stocking. Even though I had no help this night, I still had to get everything done, so I was working hard and as quickly as I could. I didn't even stop for a break or anything. But suddenly a tapping sound echoed through the store. I stopped and listened, hearing it happen again, and it sounded just like someone tapping on a window at the front of the store. I looked at my watch for the first time since I started working, and it was 2 a.m. Time had flown by, but there was no reason anyone should be here. I walked down the aisle and to the front, where I quickly saw someone outside the store. He was leaning against the window and trying to look inside. He spotted me as I walked up and stared at me. When I was just on the other side, I asked what he wanted. The man, looking like he was homeless, told me to open the door. He had a straight face, no smile or anything. I said we were closed and he couldn't be here, then turned to walk away, but the man immediately banged on the window. Not tapping like he was before. This was now harsh banging. I looked back at him, and he was clearly enraged, with his fist against the glass. Thinking this guy was crazy, I told him I'd call the cops if he doesn't leave, then started pulling my phone out to show I was serious, and only then did he step away from the window. He still had that angry look as he walked away and into the parking lot. Seeing him leave, I put my phone away and got back to work. We get a lot of crazy customers around here, so I didn't think on it too much. And again, I had to focus on getting my work done. I was only able to get a small cart of boxes stocked, so it was maybe 15 minutes later when a sudden sound echoed through the store. It sounded like something metal snapping or scraping. I quickly dropped what I was doing and ran up to the front. Nobody was at the windows, so I went up to the entrance door. It was one of those revolving glass doors, which uses a bolt lock on the top to keep it from opening when we close the store for the night. Right away, I saw that bolt was missing. Like, not even just unlocked. The entire bolt was gone. I pressed my hand on the door and it glided around, completely allowing anyone to get in. I could feel my face turn white as I realized what this meant, and I knew I needed to call the police immediately. I turned around to go to the front office, but was instantly looking into the face of that guy from before. He was only a few feet from me, still having that enraged stare. I didn't hesitate to run out the revolving door, hearing the guy follow close behind me. As I ran out into the parking lot, an old van came speeding up to the front. It nearly hit me, but I just kept running until I got to my car. When I rushed in, I noticed the guy wasn't chasing me anymore, and the van was now speeding out of the parking lot. I called the cops and spent the next couple hours explaining what happened. It wasn't until the next day that we got security footage of the man breaking inside, but it wasn't the best image quality. We can say almost for sure that they were trying to get me into their van, but we have no way to know why. I'm sure if I'd not been as quick though, I probably wouldn't have ever been seen again. I was delivering a truckload to a company on the far west coast, coming from the east coast. The route across the country is one I've taken many times before, being a truck driver for almost 20 years. It's always the same every time I make one of these drives. Same roads, same truck stops, and same everything. Over these 20 years though, I've never really had anything crazy happen. I've had a few odd scenarios, but they'd never amounted to anything. So when I was driving this route again, I had no worries in my mind. It was just another day on the job. About 20 hours into the route, a storm started coming over and slowing down my driving. It was late too, so by then I was already looking for the next truck stop to sleep at. As I drove though, a very sudden light appeared behind me. The road I was on was flat and straight, so I would have seen them coming in my mirror, but it was all of a sudden that they were right behind me. Maybe they had just turned on their lights or something. I didn't know, but they very quickly came right up to the back. I kept my eyes on them until they got so close that they were completely covered by the trailer. All I could see were their headlights reflecting off the back. But then their lights shut off. I maintained my speed and kept looking back at my mirrors, trying to see if they were still behind me, but I had no way to know. For someone to turn off their lights in the middle of a heavy storm was insane though, and to be tailing behind me so close was just as insane. Thankfully, a sign showed a truck stop was only 5 miles ahead, so at least I knew I was close to getting away from whatever this was. I didn't want to jump to conclusions based on just some weird behavior, but as a trucker, it's hard not to think about the possibility of it being an attempted robbery, especially when alone on the road at night. For the rest of the 5 miles, I saw no signs of them behind me. I was still on edge because I couldn't really see anything anyway, but I started feeling less worried as I was coming in on the truck stop. I pulled in, trying to check my mirrors to see if they followed, but with the rain and lack of lighting, it was really too hard to tell. The truck stop was mostly empty though, aside from a few trucks at the gas pumps. I pulled off to the side and parked in the middle of the lot. After waiting a minute and getting some of my stuff organized, I opened the truck door and leaned my head out, looking along the side of the trailer. I was drenched from the rain in just a matter of seconds, but from what I could tell, there was no car behind me. I closed the door and finally felt a bit of relief, grabbing my pillow and blanket from the passenger side. I locked the doors, turned off the truck, and tried to get some shut-eye. The rain pounding on the metal roof made it easy to fall asleep, blocking out any possible sounds coming from other trucks pulling in and out. When I woke up though, I felt I had only been asleep for a few minutes. I looked around, seeing it was still dark out and the storm was the same, if not worse. But before I could check my mirrors, a loud thump shook the truck. My eyes opened wider. I reached for the door handle and opened it, looking out at the back of the trailer. Through the rain, I could barely see the outline of a car with its headlights off, and 2 men moving around in front of it. Terrified, I hesitated to step out and confront them, and as I sat there in that moment of hesitation, the door suddenly slammed against my body, shoving me back further into the driver's seat. Another man stood outside, yelling at me to stay where I was, then slamming the door again. His right hand was shoved in his hoodie, and with 2 other men behind the truck, I was in no position to try anything. I could feel the truck shake as I just sat in place with the guy outside my door watching my every move. He didn't even look away for a second. This went on for a few minutes, then they ran back to their car and drove off. I was still in shock, watching their car disappear onto the road. I called the police and put in a report, but no information ever came up on who the men were. All I know is that if I had been any less aware, and had just tried to drive off at first sight of the men, I probably wouldn't have been able to make it out as safely as I did. This was in 2016. My parents had just moved to the West Coast, and I was on my way driving there to visit them. A lot of the way there is pretty empty, with only a few gas stations spread out down the long highway. At some point during my second night of driving, my check engine light came on in my car. I wasn't exactly surprised, because my car was old and not very reliable, but I wasn't really a car person either, and I had no clue what could be going on with it. I looked up where the next gas station was. It was another 30 miles away, but I really had no choice but to make it there. However, my car decided to make the choice for me instead though, as the engine suddenly cut out, leaving me coasting along the side of the road until I eventually stopped. I tried everything I could to get it working again. I even got out and looked under the hood for any possible causes of the problem, but I saw nothing. Honestly, I thought this was just the final leg of my car. In the meantime, all I could do was find a way to get help. I pulled my phone out, and I immediately felt my stomach drop as I had no service. I tried a few calls anyway, but obviously none of them went through. After 30 minutes of trying to find a solution, I realized I really only had one option, which was to hitchhike a ride. I'd never done it before, and I was kind of nervous, not really knowing what to expect. I always found it as a strange thing that I never thought I'd ever do. I stood out there on the side of the road and just waited. Every 15 or so minutes, a single car would pass by, but none of them stopped for me. This went on for hours. It was probably 2 or 3 a.m. before I saw the headlights of another car coming down the road. I stuck my thumb out, assuming it would pass by like all the rest, but to my surprise, they started pulling over. It was a black pickup truck, and I couldn't really see the driver until I walked around to the side of their car. He was a very skinny man with a long, thin face, and matched with his long black hair, it was a little unsettling. "Need a lift?" he said happily, with a big grin. Something really put me off about this guy, but honestly, I was tired, and this might be my only opportunity to get a ride, so I didn't pass it up. I hopped in the back seat. I felt like it would have been awkward if we didn't have some small talk, so I asked him what he was up to tonight. "Just cruising on the highway," he responded, like it was a hobby of his or something, which was kind of strange since we were in the middle of nowhere. I was surprised he didn't ask me what I was up to, or why I needed a ride, but I tried to think of another question just to keep the conversation going. The man interrupted my train of thought, though, when he looked at me for a few seconds in the mirror. "You don't have any weapons on you, right? Just making sure I'm safe," he said, with again that odd smile of his. I said no, thinking it was a strange question to bluntly ask, but maybe he really was just trying to watch out for himself. I don't know, but after that I stopped talking. 10 more minutes went by as I just stared out the window before the man made a sudden turn off the highway and onto a dirt road. I immediately sat up and looked around, realizing this was definitely not right. "Where are we going?" He shot a quick look at me, then continued to drive without answering. I asked him again, more loudly, as the fear was building up. "Where are you taking me?" At this point, I knew that no matter what, the next time this car stops, I was going to bolt, so I got ready with my hand on the door. As he drove down this beaten dirt road, suddenly a small farmhouse appeared in the dim lights. Its front door was wide open, and the whole place looked like it was decaying and falling in on itself. Once we got up closer, he suddenly slammed on the brakes. I jolted forward into the seat, and the man instantly swung his door open and ran around to the side door. I swung mine open as well and sprinted out, heading right for the tree line. The man ran around the car and came running up behind me, but once we were in the woods, it was so dark that I could only hear his footsteps and could no longer see him, even though he was just 10 or 15 feet behind me. I took a sharp turn, getting behind a tree and holding my breath. His footsteps came right up past me and continued further into the woods. A whole minute passed before I heard his creepy voice call out for me. Over and over, he'd repeat the same lines in the same tone of voice. "Come on, let's go back. I'll give you a ride. I wasn't trying to scare you." It was extremely disturbing. Even worse, I never heard his footsteps go back toward the car, so I had no idea where he was, or if he was lurking in the dark somewhere nearby. I knew I had to leave though, so I started quietly walking in the direction of the main road. or at least what I thought was that direction. I really couldn't see anything, but once I was deeper in the woods, I pulled my phone out and turned the brightness on low. Somehow, I happened to have service now. I almost wanted to cry from the relief. I dialed 911 and had them track the call so they knew where I was. Thankfully, I made it back to the main road and met 2 officers there. By that time, the man and the car were somehow gone. I don't know how he managed to get out of there without being seen. As for the farmhouse, it was just what it looked like. Some old abandoned place, which makes it even stranger that the man knew exactly where it was and turned into it on purpose. I have no idea what he was going to do. I'm just glad I didn't have to find out. This was only a few months ago. I was spending the weekend cozying up inside, as it was the end of winter, and these were the last few days of cold before it was supposed to start heating up. This night, it was rainy and cold, so I had nothing better to do than watch some movies and relax. But it was sometime not too long after dinner that there was a knock at the door. I got up and walked over, but looking out the peephole, I didn't recognize the man. He was wearing some brown jacket and a beanie, and he was holding a snow shovel. Seeing as there wasn't any snow on the ground, I didn't understand what he was here for. I cracked the door just an inch and asked what he wanted. It took all but 5 seconds of listening to him to know he was up to no good. He stumbled over his words and was trying to tell me a whole story about how he was just a friendly guy looking for any jobs to do in my yard. Something felt off about it and unnatural, so I said no thanks and started shutting the door, but the guy quickly put his hand on it. For a second, he just stared at me, keeping the door open, before he let go. I shut and locked it, and after processing what happened, I looked back out the window. He walked down to the sidewalk and disappeared in the rainy fog. I watched for another minute to make sure he'd actually left for good, then I went back to my movie. The guy was definitely sketchy, but I didn't think he would come back or anything, and would probably just go on to the next house. The rain had picked up over the next hour. I was still in the living room and had started another movie, although I knew I was probably too tired to finish it. My eyes were drifting in and out, but randomly, there was a thump above me that shook me awake. It was just one thump, and was kind of hard to tell how loud it actually was, with the rain outside. But what was odd about it was that it was definitely from above me. I got up and walked upstairs, looking for anything fallen over, or even a leak in the ceiling that might have made the house settle a bit. However, I found nothing. It could have been one of the gutters clicking out of place from the heavy rain, or really anything else, so I ignored it. I went back downstairs, and being more awake now, I decided to finish the rest of the movie. By the time I'd finished it and was ready to go to bed, it was nearly 12 a.m. I shut off the TV and went around turning off all the lights downstairs. But as I was walking upstairs to go to bed, I could very quickly feel the temperature drop as I got closer to the top of the steps. Maybe I was too tired to give it much thought, but when I got upstairs and started closing each of the doors that I'd opened earlier, I noticed something from the corner of one of the rooms. The window was cracked open. I must have stared at it for a whole 10 seconds, thinking how impossible that was, and just being extremely confused. I walked over and looked at it closer. It was one of the windows that had a small roof overhang under it, and before I closed it, I barely could see an imprint on the windowsill of what looked like a shoe. I could feel the blood rush from my face as I turned around and just listened for a moment. The low creaking of the house, combined with the rain speckling the roof, only made me more unnerved, knowing someone was in my house right now. I began slowly walking, as quietly as I could, back into the hallway. All the other doors were still open, making me feel like someone's eyes could be watching me right now through one of the doorways. I was able to make it downstairs though, and from there I got my phone and hid in the garage, calling 911. It took 5 minutes for the first officer to arrive. I heard nothing but the rain during that time. Once I let the officer in, I waited on my porch as he searched the home. About 2 minutes later, I heard him call out upstairs, and then he came down, holding a guy in handcuffs. I quickly recognized him as the man who showed up on my doorstep earlier in the night, and he had a terrible look of anger as he passed by me and was thrown in the car. Putting all the pieces together, the guy had climbed up onto my roof, which was likely the cause of the thump I heard hours ago. Then he got in through the second-story window, which I never had thought to even lock. Most disturbing, though, is that the officer said he was hiding in the master bedroom, which I was literally 30 seconds from entering, and maybe even falling asleep, without any idea he was in there. The guy even took his shoes off after climbing in the window to not let his shoe prints show on the carpet. So the fact that I saw the tiny imprint on the windowsill is a miracle. With him going directly to my bedroom, his intentions were clearly malicious, and thankfully the judge agreed. It's only been a few months since, but I still have sleepless nights where I can't help but feel like someone is hiding inside my home in the middle of the night. I was driving back from my friend's place in Wisconsin. I live right outside of Chicago, which is about a 6-hour drive, so I decided to do it all in one go. However, I didn't anticipate leaving so late. I wasn't on the road until 8 p.m., but I absolutely had to be home for work the following day, so there was no option to hang out any longer. If you aren't familiar with Wisconsin, it's mostly flat with a ton of forests all over the northern parts, and small towns scattered throughout. The biggest cities are closer to the border, nowhere near where I was. My buddy's place was in one of these small towns, so pretty much right out of the gate, it was barren forest roads. There were a few cars here and there, but once I was 30 minutes out and the sun had set, there wasn't a single other car. I probably went a whole 2 hours without seeing anyone else on the road. The endless flat forest on either side of me was so repetitive that it was making me sleepy. It definitely didn't help that I was so tired from hanging with my friend all weekend either. I was trying everything to stay awake, but at just around 11 p.m., I actually saw something up the road. I opened my eyes a bit wider and could tell it was a person. They were standing on the shoulder and had their thumb out, clearly looking for a ride. For some reason, the very first thought that came through my mind was that having company in the car would surely help keep me awake. I almost instinctively began slowing down, and as I got closer, they started walking down the shoulder toward my car. I rolled the window down and pulled up next to them. "Hey, I just need a ride into the next town, if you've got a spare seat for me." It was really dark out, and I couldn't see much of him, but he sounded tired. I let him into the back seat. It wasn't until I started pulling away that the thought even popped into my head about why he was out here. I mean, the middle of the woods in the middle of the night was kind of a weird place to be. I looked in the mirror. The guy was looking at me through the shadow that covered the back seat. He looked like he was 30-ish, with stubble and a buzz cut, but I didn't see a backpack or anything with him.
"So, what brought you out here?"
He asked me. I told him I was at my friend's place for the weekend and was heading back home to Chicago. Then I asked him the same question. His straight face turned into a fake smile.
"Oh, I was just walking on a trail in the woods and got lost along the way. Found the road and figured it best to catch a ride."
I thought about his answer for a second. I didn't know about any trails, or really anything at all, in these parts of the woods, but even if there was, he would have had to drive to get here. Why didn't he mention that? Wouldn't he want me to take him to the trailhead instead of into town? I don't know. I was more awake and aware now, and it was making me uneasy the more I thought about it. But then the guy suddenly told me to stop. He told me to pull over and drop him off here. I cautiously did as he said, pulling the car onto the shoulder and parking. We were maybe 5 miles down the road from where I picked him up, and there was still nothing but dense forest all around. The guy quickly opened the door, and without saying anything, he started rushing away, heading for the trees. I was super weirded out and concerned about this whole thing, and at this point, I just wanted to get out of there. But he left the door open, and when I leaned into the back seat to shut it, I noticed a drawstring bag tucked under the passenger seat. It wasn't mine, it was definitely his. I called out for the guy, and he turned around.
"Hey, you left your bag."
He stood with a straight face and wide, frustrated eyes, staring at me for several uncomfortable seconds. Then he came back.
"Your bag. You left it right here."
I pointed under the seat, and he hesitated for another several seconds before grabbing it abruptly and turning around, hurrying back into the forest. I reached over and shut the door, then left the area as fast as I could. I was relieved to be away from that guy, knowing that something was definitely up with him. But it was only a few minutes down the road that I started to pick up on an awful odor from the back seat. It got increasingly worse over the next 30 minutes, until I got into another small town. I stopped at a gas station and used my phone light to look into the back seat. On the carpet under the passenger seat, right where the drawstring bag had been sitting, there was a deep red stain. I almost threw up as I ran into the gas station and called the police. I gave them all the info I had on what happened, and they cut out the piece of carpet from my car to get tested. They also did a search for the man, but came up empty-handed, only finding a few footprints near the spot I picked him up at. I don't know exactly what was in that bag, but it seems like he was trying to plant it in my car as a means to cover something up. We still have no idea who he was or what he was up to that night. I was working a quick DoorDash shift on a Monday night. I got out of my day job at 7 and decided to make a few deliveries. It was a pretty regular, quiet night, with nothing much to note. I delivered about 7 or 8 orders before I took my last one for the night. I drove it down to the house and dropped it off, then started heading back into town, where my apartment was. It was around 10 o'clock now, and after that delivery, I was about 20 minutes out in the farmland that surrounds our town. A couple minutes into my drive back, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slowed down, and the man moved over a little bit, but not enough to be out of my way. Once I got closer, he looked right at me and stuck his thumb out. In my headlights, I could tell he was an older guy, like early 50s, and he had a large backpack over his shoulders. Since I was already slowing down, I figured I'd be helpful and ask if he needed a ride into the city, since I was heading that way anyways. He leaned on the windowsill and thanked me for stopping. His eyes looked heavy and exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. But he seemed nice enough, so I agreed to give him a ride. What I wasn't expecting, though, was for him to immediately open the passenger door and sit in the seat right next to me. It didn't really matter, I guess, but I felt like it was usually common courtesy to get in the back seat. As he got situated, I looked past him at where he came from. It was a field of tall grass, just a huge farm or something.
You from around here? What brings you out to the farmlands?
He looked over at me.
Just making my way across the country to visit my family. Don't have a car, so I've been hitching rides.
I thought that was pretty interesting, so I asked more about where he was from, but he gave me very vague and uninterested answers. A couple times I caught him looking into my back seat. Not just quick glances though, like he was running his eyes through the whole back seat and looking for something. Something about this guy started to make me feel off. He wasn't talking much and was just acting really unusual.
Is everything okay?
I asked. I still had my eyes on the road, but he didn't say anything, so then I looked over at him. My eyes were drawn to his disturbing stare before I noticed the knife he had clenched in his right hand.
Stop the car.
I didn't say a word and parked right in the middle of the road. I was terrified and just thought if I let him take whatever he wanted, then I'd get out unharmed, so that's exactly what I was going to do. As soon as the car was in park, I turned to open my door, but he quickly stopped me.
Get in the back.
He demanded, still clenching the knife. I froze up for a moment, realizing we were in the middle of empty fields, and that if I get in the back, I'll probably never have another chance to escape. He told me again, and that's also when I noticed his large backpack was slightly open by his feet, revealing a thick bundle of rope. I had no choice but to try my luck escaping now, before it was too late. I opened the door and jumped out of the car in one swift motion. The man tried jumping across the front seat to grab me, but I sprinted to the other side of the road and into the tall grass. I kept on running through the field until I felt like he couldn't find me. Then I stood still and waited. He yelled a few times from the road, but then it went quiet. All I could hear was the wind blowing the grass around. I stood still and motionless for a good 15 minutes before I slowly made my way back toward the road. I looked through the grass and could see my headlights still beaming onto the pavement and the driver door still open. The man was nowhere to be seen. After scoping it out for another minute, I sprinted up and grabbed my phone, then ran back into the grass and called 911. I didn't know if he was still hiding somewhere, waiting for me, so I didn't risk staying up there. Eventually, the police showed up, though. I couldn't believe the man didn't drive away in my car. He must have just grabbed his backpack and run off into the other field, or maybe even tried chasing me through the grass and just didn't find me. Either way, it clearly showed that his intentions were not to just rob me of my belongings, which makes the scenario 100 times more disturbing. I gave the police a description of the man, but there still haven't been any sightings.